fall asleep to the entire story of the Knights Templar, whose sacred oath beneath Solomon's temple would shake kingdoms and reshape medieval Europe. In the year 1119, 9 knights knelt in Jerusalem's ancient dust, swearing vows that would transform them from humble pilgrims into Christianity's most powerful and ultimately most betrayed warrior monks. Tonight, their complete chronicle unfolds from sacred beginnings to final flames. The medieval world balanced on a knife's edge. Christian pilgrims traversed roads thick with bandits and infidel raiders, while Jerusalem Christianity's crown jewel hung by the thinnest of threads. The Holy Land, barely won through rivers of Crusader blood, remained an isolated Christian island drowning in a vast sea of enemies. From this crucible of violence and faith would emerge something unprecedented. Warrior monks who would revolutionize medieval warfare, create Europe's first international banking system, and accumulate wealth that would make kings tremble with envy. The Knights Templar would become bankers to royalty, keepers of humanity's most sacred relics, and guardians of secrets that threatened the very foundations of Christendom. Their meteoric rise would reshape an entire continent, while their catastrophic fall would birth legends that haunt us still. The morning mist clung to Jerusalem's ancient stones when 9 knights approached the palace of Baldwin II, their armour dulled by desert sand, and their faces weathered by the unforgiving Palestinian sun. It was the year 1119, 20 years since Godfrey of Bouillon had carved the kingdom of Jerusalem from Muslim lands with Crusader steel. Yet the realm remained as fragile as morning frost. These 9 men, travel-worn and humble in bearing, carried with them a proposition that would forever alter the balance of power between East and West. Hugh de Payens of Champagne stood at their head, a knight whose penetrating gaze suggested depths of vision that reached far beyond the immediate horizon. Tall and lean, with the bearing of a natural commander, Hugh possessed that rare combination of martial prowess and spiritual fervour that mark the most dangerous of medieval warriors. Beside him stood his most trusted companion, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, whose unwavering loyalty would prove the cornerstone upon which their brotherhood would be built. Where Hugh was the visionary, Godfrey was the anchor steady, dependable, and the founding. In Solomon's shadow, the cobblestones of Jerusalem still bore the stains of conquest when Hugh de Payens of Champagne first set foot in the Holy City. The year was 1119, and the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, barely 2 decades old, trembled like a newborn lamb surrounded by wolves. Hugh was not a man of imposing stature. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as lean, weather-beaten, with the calloused hands of a minor noble who had known both sword and plough. Yet behind his unremarkable exterior burned a vision that would reshape the medieval world. Beside him walked his most trusted companion, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, a knight whose loyalty would prove as unshakable as the ancient stones beneath their feet. These 2 men, bound by friendship and shared purpose, carried with them a dream that seemed almost laughably ambitious, to protect the countless pilgrims who braved the treacherous roads between Europe and the Holy Land. Behind them followed 7 other knights whose names history has largely forgotten, as if the shadows of Solomon's temple had swallowed their identities whole. We know them only as shadows: André de Montbard, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Aignan, and 4 others whose true identities remain locked in medieval mystery. What drove these 9 men to abandon the comfort of their European estates for the dust and danger of the Levant? The chronicles speak of divine calling, of dreams and visions that haunted their sleep. Hugh de Payens himself would later write of a recurring dream, where he walked through endless corridors beneath Jerusalem, following a light that always remained just beyond reach. Whether divine inspiration or mortal ambition motivated them matters less than what they achieved. For these 9 would create an organization that would outlive empires and spawn legends that persist to this day. Their first audience with Baldwin the Tesk of Jerusalem must have struck observers as almost comical. The king of Jerusalem, adorned in silk and gold, received 9 dusty knights whose combined wealth could barely purchase a decent warhorse. They knelt before his throne not as supplicants seeking reward, but as men offering service. Hugh spoke for the group, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man accustomed to command despite his humble circumstances. Their request was simple, yet revolutionary. They sought no lands, no titles, no immediate reward. They asked only for official recognition of their mission to protect Christian pilgrims, and for quarters where they might establish their brotherhood. Baldwin, weathered by 2 decades of defending an impossible kingdom, recognized something valuable in these strange knights. Perhaps he saw their dedication, or perhaps he simply needed every sword he could muster. Whatever his reasoning, he granted them the most symbolically powerful location in all Jerusalem, chambers beneath the Temple Mount itself, in the very foundations where Solomon's magnificent temple had once stood. The irony was perfect. 9 men who had sworn to poverty would make their home in the ruins of the wealthiest king in biblical history. The quarters Baldwin provided were not palatial. Carved from living rock, these underground chambers echoed with the whispers of ancient prayers. Water seeped constantly through cracks in the stone, and winter winds howled through passages that seemed to lead deeper into the earth than any mortal construction should reach. Yet for Hugh and his companions this was sacred ground, literally the foundation upon which their faith had been built. Here, in chambers that had once echoed with Hebrew psalms, they would forge the rules that would govern their new brotherhood. Their mission appeared straightforward enough: the protection of Christian pilgrims traversing the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. These roads, stretching from the ports of Jaffa and Acre to Jerusalem and beyond, were hunting grounds for bandits, Saracen raiders, and desperate men of every description. Pilgrims often elderly, frequently wealthy, invariably defenceless made perfect prey. Contemporary accounts describe roads littered with the bones of the faithful, their final journey to the Holy Sepulchre ending in unmarked graves beside dusty paths. The Templars would change this. Their strategy was as simple as it was effective: constant patrols, armed escort services, and brutal retaliation against those who preyed upon pilgrims. But this was more than mere military service. It was a sacred calling. Each knight swore a triple oath that bound him more securely than any chain: poverty, chastity, and obedience. For 20 years they pledged they would own nothing, desire no woman, and obey their superiors without question. In an age when knights fought primarily for personal glory and material gain, such vows seemed almost insane. The oath of poverty was particularly radical. Medieval knights were essentially entrepreneurs of violence, selling their services to the highest bidder and accumulating wealth through conquest and ransom. The Templars renounced all personal property, pooling their resources for the common good. What they ate together. Where they slept as brothers. What they earned through service belonged not to individuals but to the order itself. This communal approach to wealth would later prove crucial to their unprecedented success. Chastity, too, set them apart from their contemporaries. Medieval warfare was notoriously brutal, and conquering armies traditionally claimed the women of defeated enemies as spoils of war. The Templars rejected this entirely, viewing their celibacy not as a burden, but as a source of strength. Without families to provide for or protect, they could focus entirely on their mission. Without the distractions of romantic entanglements, they achieved a unity of purpose that secular military orders never matched. Obedience completed their triumvirate of vows. In an era when knights frequently abandoned their lords for better offers, the Templars created an unbreakable chain of command. A Templar knight obeyed his sergeant, sergeants obeyed their commanders, commanders obeyed the master of their region, and all answered ultimately to the Grand Master. This hierarchical structure, borrowed from monastic tradition, would prove devastatingly effective on medieval battlefields, where coordination often meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. Yet even with such dedication, the 9 original Templars might have remained a footnote in Crusader history, were it not for one man's endorsement: Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential Christian voice of his generation. Bernard was no mere cleric. He was a spiritual giant whose words could topple kings and launch crusades. When he turned his formidable intellect toward endorsing this new brotherhood, everything changed. Bernard saw in the Templars something unprecedented. Warriors who fought not for earthly glory but for heavenly reward. In his famous treatise in praise of the new knighthood, he contrasted these holy warriors with the vainglorious secular knights of his day. Where ordinary knights fought for personal advancement, The Templars fought for Christ. Where others sought to accumulate wealth, the Templars embraced poverty. Where secular warriors often brutalized innocents, the Templars protected them. This was not merely a military order, Bernard argued. It was a new form of Christian knighthood that could redeem the entire martial class. Bernard's endorsement carried practical consequences as well. He helped draft the Rule of the Order, 72 strict commandments that governed every aspect of Templar life. These rules covered everything from how knights should cut their hair, short but not tonsured like monks, to what they could eat, meat only 3 times per week, from their daily prayers, 7 canonical hours, to their conduct in battle, never retreat unless outnumbered more than 3 to 1. The rule created not just an army, but a way of life that balanced monastic discipline with military effectiveness. The symbolism of their uniform reflected their dual nature. The white mantle, originally granted by Pope Honorius II in 1128, represented purity of purpose and freedom from sin. Unlike the dyed and decorated robes of secular nobility, Templar white was pristine, unadorned, practical. The red cross, added later, was positioned over the left breast directly above the heart. This cross was not merely decorative. It was a target announcing to every enemy that here stood a man who had chosen death over dishonour, martyrdom over retreat. But even as the Templars established their public mission of pilgrim protection, whispers began to circulate about their activities beneath the Temple Mount. For 9 years, the same period they remained a small, relatively unknown order, they excavated systematically through the ancient foundations. What were they seeking in those echoing chambers carved from living rock? Archaeological evidence suggests their search was methodical and extensive. In the 19th century, British explorer Charles Warren mapped tunnels beneath the Temple Mount that showed clear signs of medieval excavation. Templar artifacts, pottery shards, pieces of equipment, even fragments of their distinctive white robes have been found in chambers that had been sealed since their departure. The scope of their digging was enormous, covering areas that would have required years of systematic work. Contemporary chroniclers offer tantalizing hints about their discoveries. Some spoke of sacred relics, fragments of the true cross, perhaps, or vessels from the original temple. Others whispered of ancient documents, scrolls that contained secrets dangerous to the established church. Still others claimed they sought the Ark of the Covenant itself, hidden in Solomon's treasure vaults when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. What they actually discovered remains one of history's great mysteries, but the transformation of their order suggests they found something of extraordinary value. When Hugh de Payon returned to Europe in 1128 to seek formal recognition, he was no longer a poverty-stricken knight begging for alms. He commanded resources that impressed even kings. The 9 original Templars had become the nucleus of something far greater, an organization that would soon field thousands of knights and control vast networks of property across Europe. The change was so dramatic that even sympathetic chroniclers struggled to explain it. How had 9 poor knights, living in underground chambers and surviving on charitable donations, suddenly acquired the means to outfit armies and construct castles? Their official answer was simple. God blessed their holy mission, and Christian Europe responded with unprecedented generosity. Their critics suggested something far more sinister, that they had discovered secrets or treasures that gave them leverage over powerful men. Whatever the truth, by 1128 the Knights Templar had evolved far beyond their humble origins. They had created the template for every military order that would follow. Warrior monks who combined religious devotion with military prowess, who served God through violence and found salvation in warfare. They had forged bonds of brotherhood that transcended national boundaries and family loyalties. Most importantly, they had established their base of operations in the most symbolically powerful location in Christendom, the very spot where Solomon had once communed with the divine. The transformation was so complete that when Hugh de Payon prepared to leave Jerusalem for Europe, he departed not as a supplicant but as the master of an organization that would soon challenge kings and reshape the medieval world. The 9 knights who had knelt in Jerusalem's dust a decade earlier had planted seeds that would grow into the most powerful military and financial organization of their age. They had proven that properly organized, properly motivated men could achieve what seemed impossible, and they had done so while maintaining, at least outwardly, their vows of poverty and humility. As Hugh's ship pulled away from the harbour at Jaffa, the Holy Land he left behind was already changing. The roads that had once been hunting grounds for brigands were increasingly safe for Christian travellers. The Crusader states, reinforced by Templar discipline and dedication, stood stronger against their enemies, and deep beneath the Temple Mount, in chambers that had witnessed the birth of the world's most mysterious military order, the shadows seemed to whisper of secrets that would echo through the centuries. The 9 original knights had achieved their immediate goal. Pilgrims could now traverse the Holy Land with reasonable safety. But in accomplishing this mission, they had created something far greater and far more dangerous than a simple protective force. They had forged the first links in a chain of events that would reshape medieval Europe, revolutionize international finance, and ultimately lead to one of history's most shocking betrayals. The humble beginning in Solomon's shadow would soon cast darkness over the entire medieval world. The ship that carried Hugh de Payens from Jaffa's harbour in 1128 bore more than just a travel-weary knight returning to Europe. It carried the seeds of a revolution that would transform medieval Christendom. Word of the Templars' mission had already begun to spread through the interconnected web of monasteries, noble courts, and papal legates that bound medieval Europe together. By the time Hugh's weathered boots touched French soil, he found himself not a supplicant begging for recognition, but a man whose audience was eagerly awaited by the most powerful figures in Christendom. The political landscape of 1128 Europe was perfectly positioned for the Templars' emergence. The success of the First Crusade had ignited religious fervour across the continent, yet troubling reports filtered back from the Holy Land spoke of Christian territories under constant threat, of pilgrims murdered on roads that should have been safe, of a Christian kingdom that existed only through the grace of God and the strength of desperately outnumbered defenders. Hugh de Payens represented a solution to these anxieties. Here was proof that dedicated Christians could make a difference in the distant, dangerous lands where Christ himself had walked. The Council of Troy, convened in January 1129, represented the culmination of Hugh's diplomatic mission. This was no mere regional gathering, but an assembly of Europe's most influential religious and secular leaders. Bernard of Clairvaux presided with his characteristic intensity, his austere presence lending gravity to every proceeding. Cardinals and abbots from across France attended, along with powerful nobles whose lands stretched from the Channel to the Mediterranean. They came not merely to hear Hugh's report, but to witness the formal birth of something unprecedented in Christian history. Hugh stood before this august assembly no longer as the dusty knight who had first knelt before Baldwin II a decade earlier. Time in the Holy Land had marked him deeply. His hair had silvered. His face bore the permanent squint of a man who had spent years scanning distant horizons for enemies, and his hands carried the scars of countless battles. Yet when he spoke of the Templars' mission, his voice carried the unwavering conviction of a man who had found his life's purpose. He described not merely a military campaign, but a spiritual crusade, not just the protection of pilgrims, but the defence of Christianity itself. The Council's official recognition transformed the Templars from a small, informal brotherhood into a legitimate religious order with papal backing. But recognition was only the beginning. What followed would prove far more revolutionary. Pope Innocent VII's papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, issued in 1139, granted the Templars privileges that no military organisation had ever enjoyed. With a few strokes of the papal pen, the Knights Templar became accountable to no earthly authority save the Pope himself. This exemption from secular control was breathtaking in its implications. Medieval Europe was a complex web of feudal obligations, where every knight owed service to a lord, every lord answered to a king, and every king theoretically submitted to imperial or papal authority. The Templars shattered this system entirely. They could cross borders without seeking permission, establish their own courts, collect their own taxes, and wage their own wars. In effect, they became a sovereign state without territory, a kingdom without borders, answerable only to the distant voice of papal Rome. The right to keep spoils of war, another papal grant, meant that Templar victories would fuel further expansion. Where other military forces fought for their lord's benefit, surrendering captured wealth to their superiors, the Templars fought for their order. Every siege that yielded treasure, every battle that produced ransoms, every campaign that captured enemy goods, all of it flowed into Templar coffers. This self-reinforcing system would prove crucial to their meteoric rise, turning military success into organizational growth at an unprecedented rate. Perhaps most valuable of all was their exemption from taxation. Medieval Europe groaned under the weight of countless taxes, tithes, fees, and obligations that drained wealth from every productive enterprise. The Templars stood apart from this system entirely. They paid no royal taxes, no feudal obligations, no local levies. Instead, they became recipients of tax exemptions that meant their properties generated pure profit, while their competitors struggled under fiscal burdens that often consumed half their income. These papal privileges created the legal foundation for Templar expansion, but it was their ability to attract Europe's finest knights that transformed legal advantages into military dominance. The recruitment process was unlike anything medieval Europe had seen before. Rather than the haphazard gathering of warriors that characterized most military expeditions, the Templars developed a systematic approach to finding and training the elite fighters who would carry their banner. The call went out through networks that stretched across every Christian kingdom. Younger sons of noble houses denied inheritance by primogeniture found in the Templars a path to glory and purpose. Veterans of the Crusades, their wanderlust not yet satisfied by their return to peaceful European estates, saw an opportunity to continue the Holy War. Knights seeking redemption for past sins discovered that Templar service offered not just forgiveness, but a chance to transform violence into virtue. The transformation process these recruits underwent was methodical and thorough. New members entered not as fully fledged Templars, but as novices who had to prove their dedication through months of training that combined monastic discipline with military preparation. They rose before dawn for the first of 7 daily prayers, their voices joining the ancient rhythms of the canonical hours even as their bodies prepared for the brutal realities of warfare. The daily routine forged warriors unlike any Europe had ever produced. Morning prayers gave way to weapons practice hours spent perfecting sword work, mastering the complexities of fighting in heavy armor, learning to coordinate cavalry charges that could shatter enemy formations like thunderbolts. Afternoons brought instruction in siegecraft, engineering, and the 100 practical skills that kept armies functioning in hostile territory. Evenings concluded with more prayers, scripture study, and the quiet contemplation that distinguished these warriors from their secular counterparts. The result was a breed of fighter that combined the best of both monastic and military traditions. Templar knights possessed the disciplined devotion of monks. They were accustomed to hardship, inured to physical discomfort, and focused entirely on their collective mission rather than personal advancement. Yet they also demonstrated the martial skills of professional warriors, trained to a standard that far exceeded the part-time military service typical of feudal levies. Their appearance alone set them apart from other fighting men. While secular knights often displayed their wealth through elaborate armor decorations and colourful surcoats, Templars maintained an austere uniformity that was both practical and intimidating. Their beards grew long and unkempt, a deliberate rejection of the carefully groomed appearance favoured by courtly knights. Their white mantles, marked only by the simple red cross, created a visual unity that made Templar formations instantly recognisable on any battlefield. More unsettling to their enemies was their silence. Where other warriors shouted battle cries, boasted of their prowess, or hurled insults at their foes, Templars fought in disciplined quiet. They communicated through predetermined signals, moved with coordinated precision, and maintained an almost supernatural composure even in the chaos of melee combat. This silence was not mere tactical choice but spiritual discipline. They fought not for personal glory but for divine purpose, and their quietude reflected the intensity of their focus. The effectiveness of this new breed of warrior monk was first demonstrated at the siege of Damascus in 1129. The city, one of Islam's most important strongholds, had long threatened the northern borders of the Crusader states. Previous Christian attempts to capture Damascus had failed disastrously, with entire armies melting away in the face of determined Muslim resistance and the challenging logistics of maintaining a siege in hostile territory. The Templars approached Damascus not as glory-seeking adventurers, but as disciplined professionals. They established their siege lines with mathematical precision, positioning their forces to maximize defensive advantages while minimizing supply vulnerabilities. Their siege engines, constructed with knowledge gained from both European and Eastern traditions, battered the ancient walls with unprecedented effectiveness. Most importantly, they maintained the patient discipline necessary for a prolonged siege while other Crusader forces grew restless and began to fragment. The psychological impact of Templar presence extended far beyond their tactical contributions. Muslim defenders, accustomed to fighting European knights who combined individual bravery with collective disorganization, found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. These white-mantled warriors advanced with the remorseless precision of a mechanism, immune to the usual tactics of intimidation, bribery or delay that had proven effective against previous Crusader armies. When Damascus finally fell, the victory established the Templars' reputation as the most effective military force in the Christian East. Word spread through both Christian and Muslim territories that a new kind of warrior had emerged, men who combined the devotion of saints with the skills of professional soldiers, who could not be bribed, intimidated, or turned aside from their purpose. This reputation served them well as they expanded their operations throughout the Crusader states. The northern frontiers, always the most vulnerable to Muslim counterattack, became primarily Templar responsibility. Here, in a landscape of ancient castles perched on rocky heights and valleys that had witnessed the passage of conquering armies since biblical times, the Templars established a network of fortifications that would define medieval siege warfare for centuries to come. Their approach to castle construction revolutionized military architecture. Where earlier fortifications had relied primarily on height and thick walls for protection, Templar engineers developed sophisticated defensive systems that integrated multiple lines of defense, overlapping fields of fire, and ingenious mechanisms for resupplying besieged garrisons. Their castles were not merely military strongpoints, but self-contained communities capable of withstanding months-long sieges while continuing to project force throughout their surrounding territories. The development of distinctly Templar military tactics reflected their unique combination of monastic discipline and professional warfare. Their famous cavalry charges became legendary throughout the medieval world formations of heavily armoured knights that struck with the precision of clockwork and the force of avalanches. Unlike the chaotic melees that characterized most medieval battles, Templar charges maintained their formation from initial contact through complete enemy defeat, with individual knights subordinating personal glory to collective effectiveness. Their infantry tactics proved equally revolutionary. Templar sergeants, drawn from the common classes but trained to the same rigorous standards as noble knights, fought with disciplined cohesion that allowed them to stand against cavalry charges that would scatter ordinary foot soldiers. Armed with crossbows, spears, and an unwavering dedication to their mission, these common-born warriors became the backbone of a military system that could project power across vast distances while maintaining tactical flexibility that confounded their enemies. The reputation that spread across Christendom was not merely that of effective warriors, but of holy champions whose cause enjoyed divine favour. Chronicles from across Europe repeated stories of Templar victories against impossible odds, of enemy armies that fled at the sight of the Red Cross, of miraculous interventions that saved Christian territories from seemingly certain destruction. Whether these accounts reflected literal truth or propaganda mattered less than their effect. The Templars became symbols of Christian martial virtue, living proof that properly directed violence could serve godly purposes. This growing reputation attracted not only recruits, but resources on a scale that dwarfed anything the 9 original knights could have imagined. Noble houses across Europe began donating not just individual knights, but entire estates to support the Templar mission. Kings granted tax exemptions and trading privileges that multiplied the order's income far beyond what their military activities alone could generate. Wealthy merchants, seeking spiritual rewards for their worldly success, endowed Templar houses with funds that supported everything from weapon purchases to the construction of churches. The transformation was so rapid and so complete that by 1140, barely 2 decades after Hugh de Payens had first knelt in Jerusalem's dust, the Knights Templar commanded resources that rivaled those of major kingdoms. They fielded armies that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns, controlled territories that spanned continents, and possessed wealth that made them indispensable allies or dangerous enemies to the most powerful rulers in Christendom. Yet even as their military reputation reached legendary status, perceptive observers began to notice something else emerging from the Templar phenomenon. The same organizational skills that made them devastating warriors also made them remarkably effective administrators. The same discipline that held their battle lines steady also enabled them to manage complex financial operations across vast distances. The same network of communications that coordinated their military campaigns also facilitated commercial transactions that would have been impossible for less organized enterprises. But even as they took vows of poverty, gold began to flow to the Templars in unprecedented amounts. Donations poured in from across Europe. Kings granted them vast estates, and in the markets of the East, they discovered something that would change everything: the power of finance. The gold that flowed into Templar coffers from across Europe would soon be tested in the crucible of the Second Crusade, when the flower of Christian knighthood would march eastward under banners blessed by the Pope himself, only to discover that divine favour and military competence were not synonymous. By 1147, the Crusader states faced their gravest crisis since their establishment. The fall of Edessa to the Muslim Atabeg Zengi had sent shockwaves through Christendom for the first time. A major Crusader stronghold had been permanently lost to Islamic reconquest. The response from Europe was magnificent in scale and catastrophic in execution. King Louis VII of France, his soul burdened by the massacre at Vitry and seeking redemption through holy war, assembled the largest Christian army since the First Crusade. Emperor Conrad III of Germany, not to be outdone by his rival, gathered his own massive force of knights and foot soldiers. Together, these two armies represented the martial might of Western Europe, over 100,000 warriors marching eastward to reclaim Christian territory and demonstrate that Christ's champions remained unconquerable. Yet from the moment these glittering hosts departed European soil, disaster followed disaster, with the relentless inevitability of divine judgment upon the prideful. Conrad's German army, advancing through Anatolia with the supreme confidence of men who had never faced professional Muslim forces, walked directly into a Seljuk ambush at Dorylaeum. In a single afternoon of slaughter, the cream of German knighthood was destroyed, their elaborate armour and proud banners scattered across a field that had witnessed similar Christian defeats for decades. Louis's French army, warned by German survivors but convinced of their own superiority, pressed forward with the obstinate courage that characterizes disasters foretold. Their advance through the treacherous passes of Anatolia became a running battle against enemies who struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking point, discipline crumbled under constant harassment, and the magnificent army that had departed France with such confidence limped into the Crusader states as a broken remnant of its former glory. Through all of this chaos, one military force maintained its discipline, cohesion, and effectiveness: the Knights Templar. While royal armies disintegrated around them, the Templars fought with the methodical competence that had made them legendary. Their formations remained intact during the worst of the Anatolian disasters. Their supply systems continued to function when royal quartermasters had given up in despair. Their communications networks kept critical intelligence flowing, even as other forces stumbled blindly toward disaster. The contrast was so stark that it became impossible to ignore. Contemporary chroniclers noted that while the greatest kings of Europe led their armies to destruction, a relatively small force of warrior monks emerged from the same campaigns with their reputation not merely intact but enhanced. The Templars had proven that superior organisation and discipline could triumph over numerical superiority and royal pretensions, a lesson that would reshape medieval warfare and elevate the Order's status far beyond that of a simple military force. The climax of the Second Crusade came with the ill-fated assault on Damascus in 1148, where the full magnitude of royal incompetence was displayed before the watching world. Damascus, one of Islam's most important cities, had actually been allied with the Crusader states against their common enemies, a complex political arrangement that had helped preserve the balance of power in the region. Yet the assembled Christian leaders, driven by religious fervour and a fatal misunderstanding of Eastern politics, decided to attack their most useful Muslim ally while leaving their real enemies unmolested. The siege of Damascus became a masterclass in how not to conduct medieval warfare. The initial Christian assault, poorly coordinated and tactically unsound, nonetheless achieved surprising success against the city's outer defences. For a brief shining moment it seemed that divine providence might overcome human incompetence. Then royal pride and mutual suspicion destroyed what military skill had accomplished. French and German nobles, unwilling to see their rivals claim the glory of conquest, began political manoeuvring that fatally weakened the military effort. The Templars, observing this spectacle with the horrified fascination of professionals watching amateurs destroy themselves, attempted to salvage what they could from the disaster. Their engineers had identified the weak points in Damascus's defences. Their intelligence networks had pinpointed the locations where a determined assault might breach the walls. Their tactical expertise had developed a coordinated plan that could have succeeded despite the political chaos surrounding it. Yet when the final assault came, royal jealousies had so poisoned the Christian camp that effective cooperation became impossible. The attack faltered, then collapsed entirely when Muslim reinforcements arrived from Aleppo and Mosul. The retreat that followed was even more disastrous than the advance, a rout that scattered the remnants of two royal armies across the Syrian countryside and left Damascus stronger than ever, now permanently aligned with the Crusaders' enemies. Through all of this catastrophe, the Templars alone emerged with enhanced reputations. While kings and emperors slunk back to Europe as objects of mockery and contempt, the warrior monks had demonstrated that military competence transcended royal blood and noble pretensions. Their disciplined withdrawal from Damascus, conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all their operations, saved hundreds of lives and preserved valuable equipment that would have otherwise been lost to Muslim capture. The political implications of this demonstration were profound. European courts, which had previously viewed the Templars as useful but subordinate allies, began to recognize them as indispensable partners whose expertise could mean the difference between success and disaster. Kings who had initially granted the order privileges as gestures of pious generosity now sought Templar advice as a matter of practical necessity. The order's influence in European politics, already significant due to their papal exemptions and growing wealth, expanded dramatically as rulers discovered that Templar competence was worth more than royal pride. The lesson learned from the Second Crusade would reshape the Order's approach to warfare and politics for the remainder of their existence. They had discovered that military excellence alone was insufficient. Success in the complex world of Crusader politics required diplomatic skill, financial resources, and the ability to maintain independence from the competing ambitions of secular rulers. The Templars emerged from the Second Crusade not just as superior warriors, but as political actors in their own right, capable of pursuing their own agenda even when it conflicted with royal wishes. This hard-won wisdom would prove crucial when the next great crisis engulfed the Crusader states. The rise of Saladin Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub represented everything the divided Christian forces were not: unified command, coherent strategy, and the patient intelligence to exploit enemy weaknesses. Unlike his predecessors, who had been content to raid Christian territories while maintaining the profitable status quo, Saladin possessed both the vision and the capability to drive the Crusaders into the sea. The signs of impending disaster accumulated like storm clouds throughout the 1170s and early 1180s. Saladin's methodical conquest of his Muslim rivals had created a unified Islamic state that surrounded the Crusader territories like a closing fist. His diplomatic initiatives had neutralized potential Christian allies and isolated the Frankish kingdoms from effective external support. Most ominously, his intelligence networks had identified the fatal weaknesses that would allow him to achieve what generations of Muslim leaders had only dreamed of: the recapture of Jerusalem itself. The catastrophe began at the Horns of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, where the largest Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land marched directly into a trap that had been prepared with mathematical precision. King Guy of Jerusalem, new to his throne and desperate to prove his martial capabilities, had been manoeuvred by Saladin's psychological warfare into abandoning every principle of sound military strategy. Against the unanimous advice of his most experienced commanders, including the Templars, Guy led his army into the waterless hills of Galilee during the height of summer, pursuing an enemy who had carefully chosen the time and place of battle. The Templars, recognizing the trap but bound by their vows of obedience to the Christian hierarchy, could only watch in horror as strategic disaster unfolded with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. Their Grand Master, Gerard de Riedefort, had argued passionately against the campaign, his tactical experience telling him that Saladin's provocations were designed to lure the Christians into exactly this situation. Yet when the royal decision was made, the Templars marched with the rest, their discipline intact even as they prepared for what many recognized might be their last battle. The battle itself was less a military engagement than an execution. Saladin's forces, well-watered and fighting on terrain of their choosing, systematically destroyed the dehydrated Christian army through a combination of archery, psychological warfare, and careful tactical maneuvering. The famous charge of the Templar heavy cavalry, which had broken enemy lines from Damascus to Ascalon, foundered against disciplined infantry formations that had been specifically designed to counter it. When the slaughter ended, the flower of Frankish knighthood lay dead or captured on the slopes of Hattin. King Guy himself was among the prisoners, along with most of his nobles and military commanders. The true cross, carried into battle as the holiest relic in Christian possession, had been captured, and would soon be dragged through the streets of Damascus in symbolic triumph. The Crusader states, stripped of their military leadership and fighting strength, lay defenceless before Saladin's advancing armies. Yet even in this comprehensive disaster, the Templars demonstrated the qualities that had made them legendary. Those who survived the battle, a mere handful from the hundreds who had charged into Muslim lines, maintained their discipline and organization even in defeat. They refused Saladin's offers of ransom and release in exchange for renouncing their faith, choosing martyrdom over apostasy with the same calm determination they had shown in life. Their deaths, witnessed by Muslim chroniclers who recorded them with grudging admiration, became rallying cries for the Christian response that would soon follow. Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, marked the nadir of Christian fortunes in the Holy Land. The city that had been the ultimate goal of every crusade, the earthly centre of Christian pilgrimage, and the symbolic heart of the Crusader states fell to Muslim forces with surprisingly little resistance. The handful of Templar survivors, led by a few knights who had been absent from Hattin, conducted a fighting withdrawal that saved what could be saved from the general collapse, but they could not prevent the fall of the city that had given their order its name and its purpose. The news of Jerusalem's fall struck Europe like a physical blow. The impossible had happened. The Holy City was once again in Muslim hands, the Holy Sepulchre closed to Christian worship, and the Crusader states reduced to a handful of coastal fortresses that seemed certain to fall in the next campaigning season. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Third Crusade, preached with unprecedented fervour by Pope Gregory VIII and taken up by the three most powerful rulers in Western Europe. Richard the of England, the Lionheart Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and Philip Augustus of France each took the cross and began assembling armies that would dwarf even those of the Second Crusade. This time the response would be different. The disasters of previous campaigns had taught valuable lessons about the importance of sea transport, careful logistics, and professional military leadership. Most importantly for the Templars, the new crusade would recognize from the beginning that the warrior monk's expertise was not merely useful, but essential to any hope of success. Richard's arrival in the Holy Land in 1191 marked the beginning of the Templars' renaissance as a military force. The English king, himself a warrior of legendary skill and tactical brilliance, immediately recognized the value of having professional soldiers who combined individual fighting ability with institutional memory of Eastern warfare. Unlike the royal commanders of previous crusades, who had often ignored Templar advice in favour of their own preconceptions, Richard actively sought out the Order's counsel and incorporated their recommendations into his strategic planning. The partnership proved immediately successful at the Siege of Acre, where Templar expertise in siege warfare complemented Richard's strategic vision and the Crusade's superior resources. Acre, the great fortress port that controlled access to the Crusader states from the sea, had been under Muslim control since Saladin's conquests. Its recapture was essential to any hope of Christian resurgence, yet the city's massive fortifications and strategic location had made it seem nearly impregnable. The Templars' approach to siege warfare had evolved considerably since their early campaigns. They had become specialists in the complex art of reducing fortified positions, combining traditional European siege techniques with innovations learned through decades of Eastern warfare. Their engineers had mastered the use of Greek fire, the construction of sophisticated siege engines, and the patient undermining techniques that could bring down even the strongest walls. More importantly, they had learned to coordinate siege operations with naval forces, supply systems, and diplomatic initiatives in ways that maximized the effectiveness of each component. The Siege of Acre became a demonstration of this integrated approach, with Templar engineers directing the technical aspects of the assault, while their intelligence networks provided crucial information about enemy movements, and their diplomatic contacts helped maintain the complex alliance of Christian forces involved in the campaign. The fall of Acre in July 1191 was more than a military victory. It was a demonstration that the Crusader states could still be viable with proper leadership and coordination. The Templars had proven their indispensability to the success of Christian arms in the East, but they had also demonstrated something more significant. They had become an independent power whose capabilities extended far beyond simple military service. This growing independence became evident in the political arrangements that followed Acre's recapture. The Templars negotiated directly with Richard about their role in future campaigns, their control of specific territories, and their autonomy within the restored Crusader states. They were no longer mere servants of royal policy, but partners whose consent was necessary for any major strategic initiative. The pattern established at Acre continued throughout Richard's campaigns in the Holy Land. The Templars served as the backbone of Christian military operations, providing not just fighting men but engineering expertise, intelligence gathering, and the institutional continuity that enabled sustained campaigning against opponents who had the advantage of fighting on their home territories. Their castles served as bases for Christian operations, their supply networks kept armies fed and equipped, and their financial resources funded campaigns that would have been impossible without their support. Yet even as they achieved new heights of military effectiveness, the Templars were simultaneously revolutionizing the very nature of medieval fortification through their construction and renovation of castles throughout the Crusader states. The fortress of Crac des Chevaliers, acquired from the Count of Tripoli in 1142, became the most sophisticated military installation of the medieval period, a masterpiece of defensive architecture that incorporated every lesson learned from centuries of siege warfare. The construction of Crac des Chevaliers demonstrated the Templars' evolution from a simple military order into master engineers and architects, whose innovations would influence castle design for centuries. The fortress featured multiple concentric defense lines that channeled attackers into carefully designed killing zones. Its walls incorporated advanced geometric principles that eliminated blind spots and maximized defensive firepower. Its water systems and storage facilities enabled the garrison to withstand sieges that would starve out conventional fortifications. More impressive than any individual innovation was the systematic approach the Templars brought to castle design. Each fortress was planned not as an isolated strongpoint, but as part of an integrated network that could support mutual defense and coordinate regional military operations. Signal systems allowed rapid communication across vast distances. Supply routes were designed to remain secure even under siege conditions. Garrison strengths were calculated to provide both local defense and strategic reserves that could respond to threats throughout the region. Castle Pilgrim, constructed during the early 13th century, represented the culmination of Templar fortification expertise. Built on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Mediterranean, the castle was virtually impregnable to conventional siege techniques, while providing a secure base for naval operations that could threaten Muslim supply lines throughout the region. Its massive walls rose directly from the sea, making approach by land extremely difficult while ensuring that Christian naval forces could always maintain contact with the garrison. The revolutionary aspects of Templar castle design extended beyond purely military considerations to encompass the economic and administrative functions that made their territorial control sustainable. Their fortifications included sophisticated workshop areas where weapons and equipment could be manufactured and maintained. Agricultural facilities within the castle walls provided food security during sieges while generating revenue during peaceful periods. Administrative centres housed the complex bureaucracy necessary to govern the diverse populations that lived under Templar protection. These innovations in military architecture served a dual purpose. They protected Christian territories from Muslim reconquest, while demonstrating Templar power and sophistication to friend and foe alike. The sight of a Templar castle, rising like a stone mountain from the landscape, conveyed an unmistakable message about the order's permanence and capability. These were not temporary installations, but permanent statements of Christian presence in the Holy Land, built by an organization with the resources and determination to maintain them indefinitely. Yet as the Templars' military reputation reached its zenith, internal conflicts within the Crusader states began to reveal the political tensions that would ultimately prove more dangerous than any Muslim army. The success of the Third Crusade had restored Christian control over key territories, but it had also intensified competition between the various military orders, noble houses, and competing claimants to royal authority that comprised the fractious coalition defending the Holy Land. The rivalry between the Templars and the Knights Hospitaller, which had simmered beneath the surface for decades, erupted into open conflict during the final years of the 12th century. Both orders had grown tremendously in wealth, power, and territorial control, creating inevitable friction over precedents, privileges, and strategic priorities. The Hospitallers, originally focused on caring for sick and wounded pilgrims, had evolved into a military force that rivaled the Templars in effectiveness, while maintaining their own network of castles, estates, and political connections. The competition between these two great orders extended far beyond simple rivalry for resources or recognition. They represented different approaches to the fundamental challenge facing the Crusader states: how to maintain Christian control over territories surrounded by hostile populations and neighbouring powers. The Templars favoured aggressive military action, combined with careful political manoeuvring designed to preserve their independence from both Muslim enemies and Christian competitors. The Hospitallers preferred a more collaborative approach that emphasized cooperation with other Christian forces while maintaining flexibility in their relations with Muslim neighbours. These strategic differences led to increasingly bitter conflicts over military priorities, diplomatic initiatives, and the allocation of papal resources flowing to the Holy Land. Battles that should have been fought against Muslim armies were instead fought in Christian courts, with each order using its political connections to undermine its rival's influence. The unity that had characterized Christian resistance during the early Crusades gave way to factional competition that weakened the entire Crusader position. The Templars' growing independence became both their greatest strength and their most dangerous vulnerability. Their exemption from secular authority allowed them to pursue policies that served their institutional interests, even when those policies conflicted with the desires of kings and emperors. Their financial resources enabled them to maintain military forces and political influence that rivaled those of sovereign states. Their international network of properties and connections made them less dependent on local support than any other force in the Crusader states. Yet this same independence made them targets for resentment and suspicion among rulers who found their authority challenged by an organization that claimed to answer only to God. The seeds of future destruction were being sown in the very success that made the Templars indispensable to Christian survival in the East. They had become too powerful to be ignored, too independent to be controlled, and too wealthy to avoid exciting the envy of men who possessed royal titles but lacked royal resources. The political maneuvering that characterized the later Crusader period demonstrated the Templars' evolution from simple military servants to sophisticated political actors capable of pursuing complex agendas across multiple theatres of operation. They maintained diplomatic contacts with Muslim rulers when such contacts served their interests, negotiated independently with European monarchs seeking their support, and formed alliances with commercial interests that enhanced their growing financial empire. This political sophistication served them well in the short term, enabling them to maintain their position even as the military situation in the Holy Land deteriorated. Their castles remained secure when royal fortresses fell to Muslim assault. Their treasury remained full when royal coffers ran empty. Their influence in European courts grew stronger even as the Crusader states grew weaker. Yet each success in maintaining their independence alienated potential allies who might have supported them when their final crisis came. Each demonstration of their wealth and power excited the envy of rulers who would eventually see opportunities for enrichment in the Order's destruction. Each exercise of their privileged status created resentment among those who were forced to acknowledge their exemption from normal feudal obligations. The irony was perfect. The very qualities that made the Templars indispensable to Christian survival in the Holy Land also made them vulnerable to the political forces that would ultimately destroy them. Their military effectiveness, financial sophistication, and political independence. The characteristics that had enabled them to thrive when other crusading ventures failed would eventually be turned against them by enemies who recognized that the Order's wealth and power could be seized by those clever enough to manipulate the political and religious authorities who nominally controlled medieval society. While Christian knights battled for Jerusalem's stones, the Templars quietly revolutionized European commerce. They created credit systems that spanned continents, letters of credit that protected pilgrims' wealth, and a financial network that would make them the most powerful economic force in medieval Europe. The transformation began quietly in the dusty counting houses of Acre and the stone chambers beneath the Paris Temple, where monks who had sworn vows of poverty found themselves managing wealth that exceeded the treasuries of kingdoms. What started as a practical solution to the problems of medieval pilgrimage would evolve into the most sophisticated financial system the world had ever seen, a network of credit, commerce, and capital that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Ireland to the walls of Constantinople, turning warrior monks into the bankers of Christendom. The genesis of this financial revolution lay in a simple observation that would reshape medieval commerce. Pilgrims carrying gold across thousands of miles of bandit-infested roads were walking targets for every brigand and cutthroat between Paris and Jerusalem. The roads that the Templars had sworn to protect were littered not only with the bones of the faithful, but with the scattered remains of fortunes that had been accumulated over lifetimes of labour, only to be seized by thieves in moments of violence. The very wealth that pilgrims brought to honour God was financing the armies of those who preyed upon the faithful. The Templars' solution demonstrated the same methodical intelligence that had made them masters of siege warfare and castle construction. Rather than simply escorting pilgrims and their gold, they offered to eliminate the gold from the equation entirely. A pilgrim departing from London could deposit his wealth with the Templar preceptory there, receiving in return a sealed document that bore the distinctive marks and codes known only to the Order. Upon reaching Jerusalem, that same pilgrim could present his document to the Templar treasury and withdraw the equivalent value in local currency, minus a modest fee for the service provided. This innovation, the letter of credit, seems almost mundane by modern standards, Yet its implications for medieval commerce were revolutionary. For the first time in European history, wealth could travel without physically moving, protected by the reputation and military might of an organization that maintained armed strongholds from Britain to the Holy Land. The pilgrimage that had once required months of careful planning, armed escorts, and constant fear of robbery could now be undertaken with no more financial risk than a journey to the next village. The system's elegance lay in its simplicity. Each Templar house maintained detailed records of deposits and withdrawals, with coded documents that were nearly impossible to forge. The Order's reputation for honesty and their military capability to enforce their financial obligations meant that their letters of credit were accepted without question throughout Christendom. More importantly, the system generated enormous profits for the Order while solving genuine problems for their customers, the perfect foundation for a financial empire. Within a decade of its introduction, the Templar credit system had expanded far beyond the needs of pilgrims to encompass the broader requirements of medieval commerce. Merchants trading between distant cities found that Templar letters of credit eliminated the risks and costs associated with transporting precious metals across dangerous territories. Kings financing military campaigns discovered that Templar financial networks could move funds more quickly and securely than any royal treasury. Even common travellers began using Templar banking services, finding that the convenience and security they provided were worth the modest fees charged. The safe houses that anchored this system represented a new form of architecture designed specifically for financial operations. Unlike the military fortifications that had made the Templars famous, these banking establishments combined defensive capability with commercial functionality. The Paris Temple, which became the nerve centre of European finance, featured massive stone vaults that could withstand both armed assault and the passage of centuries, accounting chambers where teams of clerks maintained the complex records that made international banking possible, and meeting halls where the financial decisions that affected kingdoms were made by men who had sworn vows of poverty. These Templar banking houses developed innovations that would not be seen again until the Renaissance Italian banks centuries later. They created what amounted to checking accounts, allowing regular customers to deposit funds and then make withdrawals at different locations without the need for specific documentation for each transaction. They developed early forms of wire transfers, using their communication networks to move financial information faster than the physical movement of coins. Most remarkably, they established credit ratings for their customers, tracking the reliability and financial standing of merchants, nobles, and even monarchs across Europe. The sophistication of Templar record-keeping rivaled that of any modern financial institution. They maintained detailed ledgers that tracked not only individual transactions, but also broader economic trends, currency fluctuations, and the creditworthiness of entire kingdoms. Their clerks, drawn from the most educated men in Europe, and trained in the mathematical techniques that were just beginning to filter into Western Europe from Islamic lands, could calculate compound interest, assess investment risks, and manage financial portfolios with a precision that would not be matched by secular institutions for centuries. As word of their financial capabilities spread throughout Europe, the Templars found themselves serving an increasingly prestigious clientele. Kings, who had once viewed them primarily as useful military allies, began to recognize them as indispensable financial partners whose services were crucial to the functioning of medieval government. The transformation of the Order from warrior monks to royal treasurers represented one of the most remarkable institutional evolutions in medieval history. The relationship between the Templars and the French monarchy exemplified this transformation. King Louis VII, having experienced firsthand the logistical disasters that could destroy even the largest armies, began using Templar financial services to fund his later military campaigns. The convenience and reliability of their systems proved so superior to traditional royal financing methods that successive French kings became increasingly dependent on Templar expertise for managing not only their military expenditures, but their entire royal treasuries. By the reign of Philip Augustus, the Paris Temple had effectively become the treasury of France, with Templar clerks managing the crown jewels, royal revenues, and the complex financial arrangements that funded everything from castle construction to diplomatic missions. The irony was exquisite. Monks who had sworn to possess nothing had become custodians of the most valuable possessions of the most powerful monarchy in Europe. This role as royal treasurers elevated the Templars far above their original status as a military order. They became financial advisors whose opinions on economic policy carried the weight of their demonstrated expertise. Kings who had once commanded Templar obedience now sought Templar counsel on matters ranging from tax policy to currency devaluation. The warriors who had once knelt before royal thrones now sat as equals at councils, where the financial fate of kingdoms was decided. The Temple's role as banker to European royalty extended far beyond simple money management to encompass the complex art of royal finance. Medieval kingdoms operated on perpetually precarious financial foundations, with royal revenues that fluctuated wildly based on harvests, military fortunes, and the political loyalty of noble vassals. The Templars provided stability to this chaotic system through their ability to extend credit against future revenues, to manage currency exchanges across multiple kingdoms, and to provide the financial planning that enabled long-term policy implementation. Their lending operations, conducted with careful attention to the Church's prohibitions against usury, represented another innovation that would shape European finance for centuries. Rather than charging explicit interest, the Templars developed complex fee structures that compensated them for their financial services, while remaining technically compliant with religious law. They charged for currency exchange, document preparation, security services, and administrative overhead fees that, when calculated together, provided returns that would have been considered excellent interest rates by any standard. The Paris Temple became not merely a royal treasury but the financial heart of medieval Europe. Its vaults contained not only French crown jewels but precious metals, documents, and treasures belonging to monarchs, nobles, and wealthy merchants from across the continent. Its accounting chambers processed financial transactions that determined the outcomes of wars, the prosperity of cities, and the success or failure of commercial ventures that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The building itself, with its massive walls and soaring towers, symbolized the order's transformation from military to financial power. Visitors described corridors lined with iron-bound chests, each containing the wealth of some European noble house. They spoke of chambers filled with clerks whose calculations determined currency exchange rates across the continent. Most impressively, they described meetings where Templar financial advisors discussed loans and credits, with amounts that exceeded the annual revenues of major kingdoms. This concentration of financial power in the hands of a religious order created tensions that would ultimately prove fatal. The Church's traditional prohibition against usury put the Templars in an increasingly precarious position as their banking operations grew more sophisticated and profitable. While they maintained technical compliance with religious law through their complex fee structures, critics began to question whether warrior monks should be accumulating wealth that rivaled royal treasurers. The network that supported these financial operations extended far beyond the major banking houses to encompass the vast web of Templar preceptories that dotted the European landscape. By the 13th century, the order controlled approximately 9,000 properties spread across every Christian kingdom, creating an economic empire that generated revenues through multiple streams while providing the infrastructure necessary for their banking operations. These properties represented far more than simple real estate holdings. They constituted a carefully planned economic system designed to generate maximum revenue while supporting the order's broader mission. Agricultural estates provided both food security and tradable commodities that could be converted into precious metals. Urban holdings generated rental income while providing commercial bases for banking operations. Mills, vineyards, and trading posts created multiple revenue streams that made the order largely independent of external financial support. The agricultural component of this network was particularly sophisticated. Templar estates pioneered advanced farming techniques that increased yields while reducing costs, making them among the most profitable rural properties in medieval Europe. They introduced crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximizing production. They developed breeding programs that improved livestock quality and quantity. They constructed irrigation systems that enabled cultivation of previously marginal lands. More importantly, they integrated agricultural production with their commercial and financial operations in ways that multiplied the value of their holdings. Grain produced on Templar estates fed not only the Order's members, but provided supplies for their commercial ventures and their military operations. Wool from Templar flocks supplied textile operations that generated finished goods for international trade. Wine from Templar vineyards became a luxury export that commanded premium prices in markets from London to Constantinople. Their urban holdings demonstrated similar sophistication in maximizing economic returns. Rather than simply collecting rents from tenants, the Templars developed commercial properties that housed their own banking operations while generating income from other businesses. They established markets and trading posts that collected fees from merchant transactions while providing intelligence about commercial trends and opportunities. The mills that dotted Templar territories represented another innovation in medieval economics. Rather than simply grinding grain for local consumption, these facilities became centres of rural commerce, where the Order could convert agricultural products into marketable commodities, while collecting fees for services provided to surrounding communities. The strategic placement of these mills gave the Templars considerable influence over local economies while generating steady revenue streams that supported their broader operations. This terrestrial empire was complemented by maritime operations that extended Templar influence across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Order's naval capabilities, originally developed to support their military operations in the Crusader states, evolved into commercial enterprises that rivaled those of the great Italian merchant cities. Templar ships carried not only pilgrims and crusaders, but commercial cargo that connected European markets with the luxury goods of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Templar fleet represented a significant military and commercial asset that enhanced their strategic importance far beyond their land-based operations. Their vessels, designed for both warfare and commerce, could protect Christian merchants from Muslim pirates while conducting profitable trading ventures on their own account. The combination of military capability and commercial expertise made Templar ships among the most valuable assets in Mediterranean commerce. Their connections with Italian merchant cities created partnerships that proved mutually beneficial and enormously profitable. Genoese and Venetian merchants, whose own commercial networks complemented those of the Templars, found in the warrior monks both capable business partners and reliable military allies. Joint ventures combined Italian commercial expertise with Templar military protection and financial resources, creating trading enterprises that dominated many Eastern Mediterranean markets. Banking houses established in Constantinople and Acre served as crucial links between European financial systems and the commercial opportunities of the Eastern Mediterranean. These facilities processed not only the financial needs of crusaders and pilgrims, but the complex currency exchanges and credit arrangements that enabled East-West trade. The profits generated by these operations helped fund continued Templar military activities while enriching the Order's European treasuries. The flow of Eastern luxuries through Templar commercial networks brought European customers goods that had previously been available only to the wealthiest merchants and most powerful nobles. Spices, silks, precious stones, and exotic manufactured goods moved westward through Templar facilities, while European silver, textiles, and finished goods moved eastward. The Order's ability to coordinate these complex trading relationships while providing the security and financial services that made them possible generated enormous profits that far exceeded what their military activities alone could have produced. Naval power became an increasingly important component of Templar commercial operations as their trading ventures expanded. Their warships protected merchant vessels from piracy, while their commercial vessels carried armed guards capable of repelling attacks by Muslim raiders or Christian rivals. This combination of commercial and military capability made Templar shipping among the most reliable in the Mediterranean, attracting cargo and passengers who were willing to pay premium prices for security and dependability. Yet even as their commercial empire reached unprecedented heights of sophistication and profitability, The very success of Templar banking operations was creating the political tensions that would ultimately destroy them. European nobles, accustomed to viewing monks as objects of charitable support, found it increasingly difficult to accept that warrior monks had become wealthier than the kingdoms they supposedly served. The contradiction between monastic vows of poverty and the reality of Templar financial power became impossible to ignore or explain away. Accusations of avarice and pride began circulating through European courts as early as the late 12th century. Initially dismissed as the jealous complaints of less successful competitors, but gradually gaining credibility as the extent of Templar wealth became apparent. Critics pointed out that an order supposedly dedicated to protecting pilgrims had accumulated resources that could have funded entire crusades, questioning whether such accumulation was compatible with their religious mission. The theological implications of Templar wealth troubled even sympathetic observers. How could monks who had sworn vows of poverty justify controlling treasuries that exceeded those of major kingdoms? How could religious men, whose calling supposedly transcended worldly concerns, become the primary bankers and financial advisers to secular rulers whose policies often conflicted with church teaching? The questions had no satisfactory answers, creating vulnerabilities that enemies would eventually exploit. Political tensions with secular authorities intensified as Templar financial independence grew. Kings who had initially welcomed Templar banking services began to recognize that their dependence on the order's financial expertise had created a relationship that compromised their sovereignty. Royal treasuries managed by Templar clerks meant royal policies subject to Templar approval. Royal finances dependent on Templar credit meant royal independence limited by Templar conditions. The most dangerous aspect of this growing resentment was its concentration among the European monarchs who possessed the political and military power necessary to challenge the order's privileges. Philip IV of France, whose kingdom depended heavily on Templar financial services, found himself increasingly frustrated by his inability to control an organization that operated within his territories but answered only to papal authority. His financial difficulties, exacerbated by expensive wars and extravagant court expenses, made the vast wealth controlled by the Templars appear increasingly attractive as a potential solution to his royal poverty. Similar tensions developed in other European kingdoms as monarchs discovered that Templar financial power had created a parallel authority structure that could not be controlled through traditional feudal relationships. The order's exemption from taxation meant they accumulated wealth, while royal treasuries struggled with chronic shortfalls. Their exemption from secular authority meant they could pursue policies that served their institutional interests, even when those policies conflicted with royal objectives. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether medieval Europe would continue to tolerate an organization that combined religious authority, military power, and financial dominance in a single institution, or whether secular rulers would find ways to destroy what they could not control. The wealth that had made the Templars indispensable to European commerce and royal finance would soon make them irresistible targets for rulers who recognized that seizing Templar assets could solve their most pressing financial problems while eliminating a dangerous rival to royal authority. The irony was perfect and tragic. The same financial innovations that had made the Templars the most successful organization of their age had also made them vulnerable to the greed and envy of men who possessed the political power necessary to destroy them. The letters of credit that had protected pilgrims' wealth would not protect the order's own treasures from seizure. The banking networks that had financed kingdoms would not be able to purchase safety when kings decided that Templar wealth was too valuable to remain in Templar hands. The alchemy of gold that had transformed warrior monks into bankers had also transformed them from protectors of the faithful into targets for betrayal. The very success of their financial revolution contained the seeds of their destruction, as the wealth they had accumulated through serving others became too tempting for those others to resist seizing for themselves. By the dawn of the 13th century, the transformation was complete. The 9 dusty knights who had once knelt in Jerusalem's ruins had birthed an organization that straddled continents like a colossus. wielding influence that penetrated the deepest chambers of papal palaces and royal courts across Christendom. The Templars had transcended their original mission so completely that they had become something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a transnational power that answered to no earthly sovereign, commanded resources that dwarfed those of kingdoms, and possessed the military, financial, and spiritual authority to reshape the political landscape according to their own vision. The corridors of the Lateran Palace in Rome echoed with the measured footsteps of Templar envoys who walked as equals among cardinals and papal legates. Pope Innocent III, the most powerful pontiff of his age and arbiter of European politics, sought their counsel not merely on matters concerning the Holy Land, but on the complex diplomatic challenges that determined the fate of kingdoms. When the Pope contemplated the intricate balance between the Holy Roman Empire and the emerging power of France, Templar advisors provided intelligence networks that spanned both territories. When delicate negotiations required intermediaries who commanded universal respect while maintaining political neutrality, Templar diplomats carried papal messages with authority that secular ambassadors could never match. The Grand Master of the Temple had achieved a status that rivaled that of crowned heads of Europe. When Jacques de Molay entered the papal presence, he did so not as a supplicant seeking favour, but as the leader of an organisation whose support or opposition could determine the success or failure of papal policy. His seal carried weight equal to that of kings. His word commanded armies that could alter the balance of power in any European conflict, and his financial resources enabled or constrained the ambitious projects that defined papal grandeur. This extraordinary influence extended beyond Rome to encompass the courts of every major European monarch. The Templars had become indispensable not merely as financiers and military allies, but as diplomatic intermediaries whose unique position enabled them to broker agreements that would have been impossible through conventional channels. Their exemption from secular authority, originally granted to ensure their independence in religious matters, had evolved into a diplomatic immunity that made them ideal negotiators in conflicts where direct royal communication was politically impossible. The complexity of medieval politics created countless opportunities for Templar diplomatic intervention. When the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France found themselves locked in disputes that threatened to tear Europe apart, Templar envoys carried proposals that allowed both monarchs to reach accommodation without losing face. When English and French territorial claims created tensions that threatened to erupt into open warfare, Templar mediators provided neutral ground where competing claims could be examined without prejudicing either side's position. Marriage negotiations, those delicate arrangements that determined the future of royal dynasties while shaping international alliances, increasingly involved Templar participation as trusted intermediaries who could evaluate potential matches without the partisan loyalties that compromised other advisors. Royal houses recognized that Templar assessments of prospective alliances carried the credibility that came from institutional perspective transcending the immediate interests of any single kingdom. When the future of Crusader states depended on European marriages that could bring military support or financial resources, Templar recommendations often proved decisive in arrangements that affected the balance of power across continents. Treaty arrangements that governed trade relationships, military alliances, and territorial boundaries frequently bore Templar seals alongside those of the primary signatories. Their role as witnesses and guarantors reflected not merely their political influence, but their unique ability to enforce international agreements through their own resources and authority. A treaty guaranteed by the Templars carried implications that went far beyond the immediate terms negotiated by the primary parties. It meant that violation would bring the order's military and financial power to bear against the offending party. The intelligence networks that supported these diplomatic operations represented perhaps the most sophisticated information-gathering system of the medieval period. Templar houses from Lisbon to Acre served as collection points for political, military, and economic intelligence that flowed constantly toward the order's leadership. Pilgrim routes provided natural conduits for information gathering, while commercial operations offered pretexts for Templar agents to maintain contacts in every major European city and throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This intelligence network enabled the Templars to anticipate political developments that caught secular rulers completely unprepared. They knew of military preparations before enemy armies assembled, of diplomatic initiatives before official ambassadors departed, of economic crises before royal treasurers recognized their kingdom's financial difficulties. Knowledge truly was power, and the Templars possessed information resources that made them indispensable advisors to leaders who recognized that Templar intelligence often meant the difference between political success and devastating failure. The secret knowledge that flowed through these networks encompassed more than mere political intelligence. The Templars had become repositories for information that European rulers preferred to keep hidden from potential enemies. Details of military innovations, financial arrangements that maintained royal solvency, diplomatic understandings that contradicted public policies, and personal scandals that could destroy reputations if revealed at inopportune moments. This knowledge made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies, as rulers discovered that maintaining Templar friendship was often crucial to protecting their most vital secrets. Yet even as their political influence reached unprecedented heights, it was the Templars' military supremacy that most clearly demonstrated their evolution from regional religious order to international power. At their peak, they commanded approximately 15,000 fully equipped knights, a force that exceeded the standing armies of most European kingdoms and represented the largest concentration of professional heavy cavalry in Christendom. These were not part-time warriors who served periodic feudal obligations, but career soldiers whose entire lives revolved around military preparation and whose combat effectiveness surpassed anything that feudal levies could achieve. The supporting forces that enabled this cavalry elite to function effectively numbered in the tens of thousands. Sergeants drawn from the common classes but trained to Templar standards provided infantry backbone that could hold defensive positions against enemy cavalry while supporting their own mounted forces in offensive operations. Engineers and artisans maintained the complex siege equipment that made Templar armies capable of reducing the strongest fortifications. Supply specialists managed the logistical networks that enabled sustained military operations across vast distances without depending on local resources that might be unreliable or hostile. The discipline that characterized Templar military operations had become legendary throughout Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Where feudal armies frequently disintegrated due to competing loyalties, personal rivalries, and the pursuit of individual glory, Templar forces maintained cohesion that enabled them to execute complex tactical maneuvers even under extreme combat stress. Their famous unwillingness to retreat, codified in their rule and reinforced through decades of battlefield experience, created a psychological advantage that often proved decisive before actual combat commenced. Enemy commanders learned to fear the white mantles and red crosses that announced Templar presence on medieval battlefields. These were warriors who would charge against impossible odds without hesitation, who would hold defensive positions until death rather than surrender, and who would continue fighting with the methodical efficiency of a mechanism even when facing overwhelming numbers. The sight of Templar formations advancing with their characteristic silence and precision had been known to cause enemy forces to flee without offering significant resistance. The advanced weapons and tactical innovations that equipped Templar armies represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology. Their armorsmiths produced protective equipment that surpassed anything available to secular forces, combining traditional European techniques with innovations learned through decades of Eastern warfare. Their weapons masters developed specialized arms designed for the specific combat conditions encountered in different theaters of operation. Most importantly, their tactical doctrine evolved continuously based on battlefield experience, creating military methods that consistently outmaneuvered enemies who relied on traditional approaches to warfare. The reputation for invincibility that surrounded Templar military operations had profound psychological effects that extended far beyond their actual battlefield capabilities. Muslim chroniclers wrote of Christian warriors who fought like demons possessed, immune to fear and suffering, dedicated to death in service of their terrible god. European rivals spoke of knight monks whose combination of religious fanaticism and professional competence made them virtually unstoppable in direct combat. This reputation often accomplished more than actual warfare, as potential enemies recognized that confronting Templar forces meant facing opponents who combined superior training, equipment, and motivation with an institutional commitment to victory or martyrdom. Yet it was in the realm of spiritual authority that the Templars achieved their most complete independence from the normal constraints that limited medieval organizations. Their right to maintain private chaplains meant that they could conduct their own religious services without depending on local clergy who might be influenced by secular authorities hostile to the order's interests. These chaplains, selected and trained according to Templar standards, provided spiritual guidance that reinforced institutional loyalty while ensuring that religious observances served the order's broader mission. The confession rites granted to Templar chaplains represented an extraordinary privilege that reflected their special relationship with papal authority. Members of the order could confess their sins to their own priests without seeking absolution from local bishops or parish clergy, creating a closed spiritual system that prevented outside authorities from using religious requirements to influence Templar behavior. This privilege had practical implications that extended far beyond religious observance, as it meant that Templar operations could remain secret even from church officials who might otherwise have access to information revealed through the sacrament of confession. Their own religious ceremonies and rituals, developed over decades of institutional evolution, reflected the unique character of warrior monks whose spiritual lives differed fundamentally from those of conventional religious orders. These ceremonies combined traditional Christian observances with military elements that acknowledged the violent reality of Templar service while maintaining the order's essential religious character. The exact nature of these rituals remained carefully guarded secrets that only initiated members witnessed, creating an aura of mystery that enhanced the order's reputation while protecting practices that might have been misunderstood by outsiders. The direct relationship with papal authority that exempted the Templars from local church control represented perhaps their most valuable privilege, enabling them to pursue policies that served their institutional mission even when those policies conflicted with the desires of regional bishops or archbishops. Local clergy, no matter how powerful within their own territories, possessed no authority over Templar operations, and could not interfere with order activities even when those activities challenged local religious or political establishments. This exemption from local church authority created tensions that paralleled those developing with secular rulers who found themselves unable to control Templar operations within their own territories. Bishops and archbishops, accustomed to exercising spiritual authority over all religious activities within their jurisdictions, discovered that Templar houses operated according to different rules and answered to different authorities. The resulting conflicts often forced local church officials to choose between supporting an organization that enjoyed papal favor or defending their own jurisdictional prerogatives. Yet even as the Templars achieved unprecedented spiritual independence, rumors began circulating about heretical practices and secret rites that allegedly characterized their private religious observances. These whispers, initially dismissed as the malicious gossip of envious competitors, gradually gained credibility as the order's secrecy and independence made it impossible to verify or refute the accusations. Critics pointed out that an organization exempt from normal spiritual oversight might well develop practices that deviated from orthodox Christian doctrine without facing correction from proper religious authorities. The rumors range from relatively minor accusations of ritualistic peculiarities to far more serious charges of fundamental doctrinal deviation. Some claimed that Templar initiation ceremonies included elements that mocked traditional Christian beliefs. Others suggested that their private religious services incorporated practices borrowed from Islamic or Eastern Christian traditions encountered during their operations in the Holy Land. Most seriously, some accusers whispered that the order's leadership had been corrupted by exposure to heretical knowledge discovered during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount. These accusations gained particular traction because the Templars' secrecy made independent verification impossible. Unlike other religious orders whose practices were open to oversight by local bishops and whose members regularly interacted with secular clergy, the Templars maintained institutional isolation that prevented outsiders from observing their internal operations. This secrecy, originally designed to protect military and commercial information that enemies might exploit, also protected whatever religious practices the order had developed during its evolution from simple military force to international power. The theological implications of Templar independence troubled even sympathetic observers who recognized that complete exemption from spiritual oversight might enable doctrinal drift that could lead to serious errors. How could any religious organization, no matter how well-intentioned, maintain orthodox practices without the corrective influence of broader church authority? The question had no satisfactory answer, creating vulnerabilities that critics would eventually exploit to justify the most serious charges that could be levelled against any medieval religious order. As the Templars stood at the pinnacle of their power, commanding influence that spanned continents and encompassed every aspect of medieval life, military, financial, political, and spiritual, the very completeness of their success contained the elements that would ensure their destruction. They had become too successful, too independent, and too powerful for medieval Europe to tolerate indefinitely. The system that had enabled their rise could not accommodate an organization that transcended all normal categories and answered to no authority that secular rulers could control or influence. But in their greatest triumph lay the seeds of their destruction. The Templars had become too powerful, too wealthy, too independent. Kings who once begged for their aid now feared their influence, and in France, a monarch drowning in debt saw a solution that would require the most audacious betrayal in medieval history. In the marble halls of the royal palace at Fontainebleau, where the autumn light of 1307 filtered through stained glass windows that depicted the glorious conquests of French kings, Philip V sat brooding over account books that told a story of impending financial catastrophe. The man they called the Iron King for his inflexible will and the metallic coldness of his pale blue eyes had inherited the most powerful monarchy in Europe, yet found himself trapped by debts that threatened to reduce France to bankruptcy and himself to the humiliating status of a beggar among kings. The irony was bitter beyond endurance. Philip ruled territories that stretched from the English Channel to the Mediterranean, commanded armies that had humbled the greatest nobles of Europe, and wore a crown that made him the equal of emperors. Yet his treasury remained perpetually empty, drained by the endless expenses of maintaining royal magnificence, financing military campaigns that had yielded more glory than profit, and supporting a court whose extravagance had become legendary throughout Christendom. Every month brought new demands for funds that the royal coffers could not provide, while every attempt to raise additional revenue through taxation had met with resistance that threatened the stability of his reign. The king's financial advisers, men whose careers depended upon their ability to discover sources of income that could sustain royal ambitions, had exhausted every conventional expedient for addressing the crisis. They had debased the currency until French coins were no longer accepted at face value in international commerce. They had imposed new taxes on everything from salt to marriage licenses, creating resentment that bubbled beneath the surface of French society like molten rock seeking an outlet. They had borrowed against future revenues until the kingdom's creditworthiness had been stretched to the breaking point. Yet through every financial expedient and desperate measure, one source of potential wealth had remained tantalizingly beyond reach: the vast treasures of the Knights Templar. Philip had watched with growing frustration as warrior monks who claimed to have renounced worldly possessions accumulated riches that exceeded his own royal resources. The Paris Temple, rising like a fortress in the heart of his capital city, contained vaults filled with gold that could solve every financial problem his kingdom faced, yet remained as inaccessible as if it had been locked away in heaven itself. The king's character had been forged in the crucible of medieval politics, where survival required the ability to strike swiftly and without mercy against any threat to royal authority. He had already demonstrated his willingness to challenge the most sacred institutions of medieval society when those institutions interfered with his vision of absolute monarchy. His conflict with Pope Boniface VIII had shocked Christendom with its audacious disregard for traditional papal supremacy, yet Philip had emerged victorious when the aged pontiff died, under circumstances that many believed involved French agents acting on royal orders. The humiliation of Pope Boniface at Anagni in 1303, where French troops had physically assaulted the Vicar of Christ in his own palace, had established Philip's reputation as a ruler who would stop at nothing to protect his royal prerogatives. When Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief minister and the architect of that unprecedented assault on papal dignity, had slapped the Pope's face in full view of his cardinals and courtiers, it had announced to the world that the King of France recognized no authority higher than his own will. The successful relocation of the papacy from Rome to Avignon represented the culmination of Philip's campaign to subordinate church authority to royal policy. Pope Clement V, elected through French influence and maintained in power through French protection, had proven far more amenable to royal suggestions than his predecessor. The papal court that now resided in French territory, surrounded by French influence and dependent upon French goodwill, provided Philip with ecclesiastical authority that could legitimize whatever actions he deemed necessary for the preservation of his kingdom. This control over papal policy would prove crucial for the plan that was taking shape in the king's mind as he contemplated the Templar problem, an organization that claimed exemption from royal authority while accumulating wealth within French territories, presented a challenge that conventional political methods could not address. The Templars' papal privileges meant that direct royal action against them would constitute an attack on church authority that could provoke dangerous resistance. Yet if the Church itself could be convinced that the Templars represented a threat to Christian orthodoxy, then their destruction could be accomplished through ecclesiastical channels that would shield the monarchy from accusations of impious greed. The accusations against the Templars that began circulating through French society in the early years of the 14th century provided exactly the pretext that Philip's developing plan required. These whispers, which may have originated from genuine concerns about Templar secrecy, or may have been deliberately encouraged by royal agents seeking to prepare public opinion for what was to come, painted a picture of an organization that had been corrupted by wealth, power, and exposure to heretical influences encountered during their eastern operations. The stories grew in the telling, as such stories always do when they serve the purposes of powerful men who have reasons to encourage their spread. Initial complaints about Templar arrogance and excessive independence evolved into accusations of doctrinal deviation. Claims that their initiation ceremonies included unusual elements developed into charges of heretical practices that mocked fundamental Christian beliefs. Observations about their secretive behavior transformed into allegations of conspiracy against church and crown. The most serious accusations touched upon practices that, if true, would justify the most severe ecclesiastical punishments available to medieval justice. Stories circulated about initiation rites that required new members to spit upon the cross, to deny Christ, and to participate in blasphemous parodies of Christian worship. Whispers spoke of secret ceremonies where the Templars worshipped a mysterious idol known as Baphomet, described variously as a bearded head, a cat-like demon, or a hermaphroditic figure that combined male and female characteristics in a grotesque mockery of divine creation. Perhaps most damaging of all were the accusations of sodomy that violated not only church law, but the fundamental medieval understanding of proper masculine behavior. These charges, which may have originated from misunderstandings about the brotherly intimacy that characterized monastic communities, were embellished with lurid details about Templar practices that allegedly combined religious blasphemy with sexual perversion in ways that shocked even sophisticated courtiers accustomed to the scandals that regularly emerged from medieval religious houses. The building case against the Templars gained credibility through the systematic collection of testimony from individuals who claimed first-hand knowledge of Templar practices. Some of these witnesses may have been genuine former members of the order who had developed grievances against their former brothers. Others were likely paid informants whose testimony was shaped by the specific accusations that royal investigators wished to substantiate. Still others may have been prisoners or debtors who hoped to gain royal favour through providing the evidence that Philip's agents were seeking to gather. The coordinated nature of these accusations, which appeared simultaneously in different parts of France and consistently focused on the same specific practices, suggests careful orchestration by authorities who understood the legal requirements for bringing successful charges of heresy. The testimony was detailed enough to seem credible, consistent enough to suggest widespread institutional corruption, and shocking enough to justify the most severe remedies available to ecclesiastical justice. As these accusations gained currency throughout French society, the Templars found themselves in the impossible position of trying to defend against charges that their own secrecy made difficult to refute. Their exemption from local church oversight, originally granted to protect their independence, now prevented sympathetic clergy from providing testimony about their actual religious practices. Their isolation from secular society, which had enabled them to maintain military discipline and institutional loyalty, now left them without allies who could contradict the increasingly elaborate stories being told about their alleged crimes. The tragic figure at the centre of this gathering storm was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, whose election to that supreme office in 1292 had placed him at the head of an organisation approaching the peak of its power and the beginning of its destruction. De Molay, a knight of unquestioned personal courage and deep religious conviction, had spent his career serving the order in the dangerous territories of the eastern Mediterranean, where his military leadership and administrative competence had earned him the respect of his peers and the position of ultimate authority over the most powerful military organisation in Christendom. His election as Grand Master had come at a time when the Templars faced mounting pressure to justify their continued existence as a military order following the final loss of Christian territories in the Holy Land. The fall of Acre in 1291 had marked the end of the Crusader states and raised fundamental questions about the future role of organisations that had been created specifically to defend Christian holdings in the East. If there were no longer Christian territories to protect, what purpose could military orders serve that would justify their continued privileges and resources? De Molay's response to this existential challenge had been characteristically direct and uncompromising. Rather than accepting that the Templars' military mission had ended with the loss of the Holy Land, he had advocated for new crusades that would recapture Jerusalem and restore Christian control over the sacred sites. His vision was grand in scope and deeply traditional in its assumptions about the proper relationship between Christianity and Islam. A massive military expedition that would combine the resources of all European kingdoms under Templar leadership to achieve what individual crusades had failed to accomplish. The practical obstacles to implementing this vision were enormous. The European kingdoms that would need to provide the military and financial resources for such an expedition were increasingly focused on conflicts with each other rather than cooperation against external enemies. The financial costs of mounting a crusade large enough to succeed where previous expeditions had failed would require resources that exceeded what any combination of European treasuries could provide. Most critically, there was little evidence that European populations retained the religious enthusiasm that had motivated the earlier crusades, making it unlikely that the necessary popular support could be generated for such an ambitious undertaking. Yet de Molay persisted in his advocacy for renewed crusading activity, perhaps because he recognized that the alternative accepting that the Templars' military mission had become obsolete would inevitably lead to questions about whether the order itself had outlived its usefulness. His negotiations with papal authorities about organizing new expeditions to the east represented desperate attempts to maintain institutional relevance in a world that was rapidly moving beyond the medieval synthesis of religious fervour and military action that had created the crusading movement. The merger proposal with the Knights Hospitaller, which had been suggested by various church authorities as a practical solution to the administrative inefficiencies created by maintaining multiple military orders, represented exactly the kind of institutional compromise that de Molay was determined to resist. Such a merger would have preserved the essential functions that both orders served while eliminating the expensive duplication of administrative structures that had developed during their centuries of rivalry. For the Church, it represented a rational approach to institutional reform that could strengthen Christian military capabilities while reducing costs. For de Molay, however, the merger proposal threatened everything that had made the Templars unique and powerful. Their independence, their distinctive traditions, their separate identity as the premier Christian military order, all of this would be lost in a combined organization that would inevitably be dominated by compromise and committee decision-making rather than the unified command structure that had made Templar military operations so effective. His rejection of the merger proposal, couched in diplomatic language but absolute in its substance, may have been the final factor that convinced Philip IV that the Templars could not be reformed or controlled through conventional means. An organization that refused to accept papal guidance about adapting to changing circumstances, that insisted upon maintaining its independence even when that independence served no apparent purpose, and that controlled resources which could solve the financial problems of kingdoms while refusing to make those resources available for constructive purposes, had essentially declared itself an enemy of the rational administration of Christian society. De Molay's decision to return to France in 1307, ostensibly to discuss crusading plans with the king and pope, represented either remarkable naivete about the political forces that were gathering against his order, or a conscious decision to face whatever challenges awaited him on the ground where they could be met most directly. His presence in French territory would provide Philip with the opportunity that the king had been seeking, the chance to act against the Templars' leadership while they were physically within his power and unable to escape to the safety of their eastern strongholds. The trap that was being prepared with meticulous care in the months leading up to October 1307 represented a masterpiece of medieval political planning that combined legal, religious, and military elements in a coordinated assault on an organization that had seemed impregnable. Guillaume de Nogaret, whose previous success in humiliating Pope Boniface VIII had established his reputation as Philip's most effective agent for implementing policies that required a combination of legal expertise and ruthless determination, had been tasked with developing the specific mechanisms that would enable royal action against the Templars while maintaining the appearance of ecclesiastical legitimacy. The coordination with the Inquisition provided the essential religious authority that would transform what might otherwise have appeared as royal robbery into a holy crusade against heretical corruption. The Inquisition's established procedures for investigating and prosecuting religious crimes offered a legal framework that could justify the most extreme measures while protecting Philip from accusations of acting from purely mercenary motives. More importantly, inquisitorial procedures included provisions for the confiscation of property belonging to convicted heretics, providing a legal mechanism for transferring Templar wealth to royal control. The preparation of arrest warrants that would enable simultaneous action against Templars throughout French territories required administrative capabilities that demonstrated the sophistication of Philip's governmental apparatus, coordinating military operations across a kingdom as large as France, maintaining secrecy until the moment of action, and ensuring that local officials would execute their orders without advance warning to potential targets, represented logistical challenges that would have been impossible for earlier medieval monarchies to accomplish. The recruitment of spies and informants who could provide intelligence about Templar locations, routines, and defensive capabilities required the creation of intelligence networks that paralleled those maintained by the Templars themselves. Philip's agents had to identify individuals within Templar organizations who could be turned against their former brothers, develop covers that would enable surveillance of heavily fortified Templar properties, and maintain security procedures that would prevent premature discovery of the developing plot. As the autumn of 1307 progressed and the date of Friday, October 13th approached, the elements of Philip's plan moved toward convergence with the precision of a medieval siege engine preparing to launch its devastating payload. The accusations against the Templars had been developed and documented. The legal procedures for their prosecution had been established. The military forces necessary to enforce royal will had been positioned, and the ecclesiastical authority required to legitimize the entire operation had been secured through French control over the Avignon papacy. The Templars themselves, confident in their privileges and secure in their belief that their services to Christendom provided protection against any conceivable threat, continued their normal routines without recognizing that they were walking into a trap that had been prepared with the methodical patience of a spider waiting for flies to become entangled in its web. The very secrecy and independence that had made them powerful had also isolated them from the intelligence networks that might have warned them of their approaching doom. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of an order that had once seemed destined to endure forever, prepared for what he believed would be routine negotiations about future crusading plans, unaware that he was about to become the central figure in one of history's most spectacular betrayals. The dawn that was about to break over France would illuminate not the beginning of a new crusade, but the end of an institution that had shaped medieval Europe for 2 centuries. The net was closing, and Friday the 13th approached with all the inexorable certainty of divine judgment upon the proud. The darkness before dawn on October 13th, 1307, carried with it an unnatural stillness that seemed to hold all of France in suspended animation, as if the very air recognized that history was about to pivot, on the edge of an act so audacious that it would be remembered for centuries as the moment when medieval certainties died and modern ruthlessness was born. In castles and manor houses across the kingdom, royal sergeants moved through corridors with the silent precision of executioners, carrying sealed orders that would shatter the most powerful military organization in Christendom before the sun reached its zenith. The coordination required for what was about to unfold represented a masterpiece of medieval administration that demonstrated just how sophisticated Philip IV's governmental apparatus had become. From the fog-shrouded ports of Normandy to the sun-baked hills of Languedoc, from the industrial towns of Flanders to the mountain fortresses of the Pyrenees, royal officers had positioned themselves outside every known Templar establishment, with orders that were breathtaking in their scope and devastating in their implications. Arrest every member of the Knights Templar within French territory, seize all their possessions, and begin immediate interrogation procedures designed to extract confessions of heresy, blasphemy, and crimes against the Christian faith. The dawn raids commenced with military precision that would have impressed the Templars themselves, had they been in any position to appreciate the professional competence of their destroyers. At the Paris temple, where Jacques de Molay had spent the night in prayer and contemplation, preparing for what he believed would be routine negotiations about future crusading plans, the heavy oak doors that had protected the Order's treasury for decades splintered under the assault of royal soldiers who carried axes alongside their warrants. The Grand Master, roused from his devotions by the crash of splintering wood and the shouted commands of armed men, emerged from his private chapel to find himself surrounded by sergeants whose faces showed no trace of the deference that his rank had commanded for 15 years. The arrest of Jacques de Molay represented more than the capture of an individual. It symbolized the destruction of an institution that had seemed as permanent as the stones of Jerusalem itself. The man who had commanded armies, negotiated with kings, and wielded authority that spanned continents, found himself bound with common rope and marched through the corridors of the fortress that had served as his headquarters, past vaults filled with gold that would soon fill Philip's treasury, past chambers where centuries of Templar records would be seized and scrutinized for evidence of the crimes that had already been determined to exist. Across France, the scenario repeated itself with variations that demonstrated both the thoroughness of Philip's planning and the completeness of the Templars' surprise. In Poitiers, veteran knights who had fought at Acre and survived the fall of the Crusader states found themselves overwhelmed by royal forces that had surrounded their preceptory during the night. In Cahors, Templar sergeants who had managed vast agricultural estates and sophisticated commercial operations were dragged from their beds and chained like common criminals. In Toulouse, elderly brothers who had spent decades in contemplative service to their order discovered that their lifetime of devotion was now evidence of participation in a heretical conspiracy. The simultaneous nature of these arrests across territories that encompassed hundreds of miles represented a logistical achievement that few medieval governments could have accomplished. Yet Philip's administration had coordinated the operation with clockwork precision, ensuring that no significant group of Templars could escape or warn their brothers in other locations. The network of fortresses, commercial establishments, and religious houses that had taken 2 centuries to construct was dismantled in a single morning by men who carried royal authority and showed no hesitation in wielding it against organizations that had previously seemed immune to secular interference. The reading of charges in public squares throughout France transformed what might have been seen as royal aggression into a dramatic revelation of hideous crimes that allegedly threatened the very foundations of Christian society. Town criers, their voices carrying across market squares where citizens had gathered to witness this unprecedented spectacle, proclaimed accusations that were calculated to shock and horrify audiences whose understanding of proper religious behaviour made the alleged Templar crime seem almost incomprehensible in their wickedness. The formal indictment, containing 127 specific charges against the order, represented a comprehensive catalogue of religious and moral offences that covered every conceivable form of heretical behaviour. The document, prepared with legal precision that reflected Guillaume de Nogaret's expertise in canonical law, accused the Templars of crimes that range from doctrinal deviation to sexual perversion, from financial corruption to treasonous conspiracy against Christian kingdoms. The most shocking accusations centered on allegations that Templar initiation ceremonies required new members to deny Christ, spit upon the cross, and participate in blasphemous rituals that mocked the central symbols of Christian faith. According to the charges, these ceremonies took place in secret chambers where the sacred symbols of Christianity were subjected to deliberate desecration, while new knights swore oaths that bound them to an organization that had secretly abandoned Christian doctrine in favor of heretical beliefs borrowed from Islamic or other non-Christian sources encountered during their Eastern operations. The worship of Baphomet, described in the charges as a demonic idol that the Templars allegedly venerated in place of Christ, provided the most sensational element in an indictment that was designed to justify the most extreme measures available to medieval justice. This mysterious figure, variously described as a bearded head, a cat-like demon, or a hermaphroditic creature that combined male and female characteristics, was allegedly the true object of Templar devotion, worshipped in ceremonies that combined religious blasphemy with sexual practices that violated both canon law and natural order. The accusations of homosexual practices, described in lurid detail that was calculated to horrify medieval audiences whose understanding of proper masculine behaviour made such activities seem not merely criminal but fundamentally unnatural, provided additional justification for viewing the Templars as an organisation that had been corrupted beyond any possibility of redemption. These charges, which may have originated from misunderstandings about the close relationships that characterised monastic communities, were embellished with specific allegations about ritual requirements that supposedly forced new members to participate in sexual activities with their initiators. Financial crimes and conspiracy against Christian kingdoms rounded out an indictment that portrayed the Templars not merely as religious deviants, but as political traitors whose accumulation of wealth had been undertaken in service of goals that threatened the stability of European society. The charges suggested that Templar financial operations had been designed to undermine royal authority, that their commercial networks had been used to support enemies of Christian kingdoms, and that their military capabilities had been maintained not for the defence of pilgrims, but for potential use against the very rulers who had granted them their original privileges. The initial shock that swept through Europe as news of the arrests spread represented more than simple surprise at unexpected events. It reflected the fundamental disruption of assumptions that had governed medieval political life for centuries. The Templars had seemed as permanent and reliable as sunrise itself, their white mantles and red crosses as familiar a sight in European cities as the local cathedral spires. Their sudden transformation from respected defenders of the faith into accused heretics and traitors challenged basic beliefs about the nature of religious authority and the reliability of institutions that had seemed divinely protected. The Inquisition that followed the arrests represented the systematic application of ecclesiastical legal procedures to questions that had profound political implications. Guillaume de Paris, the chief inquisitor whose previous experience in prosecuting religious crimes had established his reputation as a thorough and effective investigator, approached the Templar cases with methodical precision that would extract whatever information was required to support the charges that had already been formulated. The torture methods employed against captured Templars reflected both the standard practices of medieval justice and the specific requirements of cases where confession was considered essential for successful prosecution. The techniques ranged from relatively mild forms of coercion, such as prolonged interrogation and sleep deprivation, to more severe procedures that included the application of heated metal to sensitive parts of the body, the dislocation of limbs through mechanical stretching, and other methods that were designed to break the will of even the most determined resistance. The first confessions obtained under these conditions provided the evidence that Philip's agents required to justify the continuation and expansion of their investigation. Jacques de Molay himself, subjected to interrogation techniques that combined physical coercion with psychological pressure, eventually signed a confession that admitted to the charges of denying Christ and spitting upon the cross during his own initiation into the order decades earlier. His confession, obtained from the most senior Templar in custody, provided crucial credibility for accusations that might otherwise have seemed incredible to skeptical observers. The documentation of testimonies extracted from captured Templars represented a massive administrative undertaking that produced thousands of pages of recorded confessions, accusations, and supporting evidence. Teams of clerks worked continuously to transcribe interrogation sessions, prepare summaries for papal authorities, and maintain the detailed records that would be required for the legal proceedings that were expected to follow. This documentation, preserved in archives that survived the centuries, provides modern historians with detailed insight into both the charges against the Templars and the methods used to extract supporting evidence. The spreading of arrests across Europe represented the international dimension of what had begun as a French royal initiative. Philip's success in securing papal support for his actions meant that other European kingdoms found themselves under pressure to take similar action against Templars within their own territories. The papal bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, issued by Pope Clement V, ordered all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their property, pending investigation of the charges that had been raised against the order. Pope Clement V's initial response to Philip's action revealed the impossible position in which the French king's manoeuvring had placed the papal authority. The Pope's surprise and anger at learning of the arrests after they had already taken place reflected his recognition that Philip had effectively usurped ecclesiastical authority over a religious order that was supposed to answer only to Rome. Yet Clement's position as a French-supported pope residing in Avignon made direct confrontation with Philip politically impossible, forcing him to seek ways of regaining control over the situation without openly challenging the king who had made his papacy possible. The papal bull Pastoralis Praeeminentium, while appearing to support Philip's actions by ordering similar arrests throughout Christendom, actually represented Clement's attempt to transfer authority over the Templar investigation from national governments to ecclesiastical courts that would ultimately answer to Rome rather than to secular rulers. The Pope's strategy was subtle but significant. By making the Templar investigation a matter of church rather than royal authority, he hoped to regain control over proceedings that could determine not only the fate of the Templars, but the broader relationship between spiritual and temporal power in medieval Europe. The political manoeuvring between king and pope that followed the initial arrests represented a complex struggle for control over an investigation whose outcome would determine whether secular rulers could successfully challenge religious orders whose privileges had previously made them immune to royal authority. Philip's position was strong but not unassailable. He had succeeded in seizing Templar assets and personnel, but he needed continuing papal support to legitimize actions that might otherwise be seen as simple robbery disguised as religious persecution. The confessions and retractions that followed the initial interrogations revealed both the effectiveness of medieval torture techniques and the courage of individuals who were willing to suffer extreme physical pain rather than provide false testimony against their former brothers. Jacques de Molay's initial confession, obtained under duress and witnessed by papal representatives who had been summoned to verify its authenticity, represented the greatest victory that Philip's investigation had achieved, the admission of guilt by the Templars' own leadership. Yet de Molay's later recantation of his confession, announced publicly before witnesses who could testify to its authenticity, represented a moment of moral courage that transformed him from a broken old man who had succumbed to torture into a martyred hero, whose defiance inspired others to similar acts of resistance. His declaration that he had lied under torture, that the Templars were innocent of the charges against them, and that he was prepared to die rather than maintain false testimony against his order, provided a rallying point for defenders of Templar innocence, while creating a credibility crisis for the entire investigation. The courage of Templars who refused to confess despite torture, imprisonment, and the prospect of execution provided additional evidence that the order retained the loyalty of men who were willing to die for their beliefs. These individuals, whose names are largely lost to history but whose resistance was documented in inquisitorial records, demonstrated that the charges against the Templars were not universally accepted even by members of the order, who had every incentive to save themselves through cooperation with their accusers. Those who died under torture rather than provide the confessions that their interrogators demanded represented the ultimate testimony to Templar innocence. Their willingness to endure death rather than bear false witness against their brothers provided more convincing evidence of the order's true character than any formal legal proceeding could have produced. These martyrs, whose sacrifice received little recognition during their lifetimes, became symbols of resistance against injustice that would inspire later generations seeking to understand the relationship between power and truth in medieval society. The credibility crisis that eventually undermined the case against the Templars emerged from the contradictions between the evidence that torture produced and the evidence that emerged from more careful investigation of actual Templar practices. As the investigation expanded beyond France to include other European kingdoms, where torture was used less extensively, or where secular rulers had less interest in supporting charges against the Templars, the testimony became less consistent and more obviously fabricated. The ultimate irony of Philip's masterfully planned operation was that its very success contained the seeds of its ultimate failure to achieve lasting credibility. The French king had succeeded in destroying the Templars as an organization, seizing their wealth and eliminating their challenge to royal authority. Yet he had not succeeded in convincing posterity that his actions were justified by the evidence he claimed to have discovered. The Friday of Betrayal had accomplished everything that political necessity required, while achieving nothing that historical justice could accept. The echoes of that terrible Friday had barely faded when Pope Clement V found himself trapped in a web of political necessity and spiritual obligation that would test the very foundations of papal authority. As reports of confessions extracted under torture reached Avignon, accompanied by urgent demands from Philip IV for immediate papal condemnation of the Templars, Clement recognized that he faced a crisis that would define not only the fate of the warrior monks but the future relationship between church and crown throughout Christendom. The Pope, who had been elevated to the chair of Peter through French influence, now discovered that his spiritual responsibilities demanded actions that might destroy the political alliance upon which his papacy depended. The establishment of the Papal Commission in the summer of 1308 represented Clement's desperate attempt to regain control over an investigation that had been initiated without his knowledge and conducted according to procedures that violated fundamental principles of ecclesiastical justice. The commission, composed of carefully selected cardinals and church officials, whose loyalty to papal authority exceeded their political connections to any secular ruler, was tasked with conducting an independent investigation that would determine the truth behind the accusations that had already condemned the Templars in the court of public opinion. Cardinal Berenguer Frédol, a man whose reputation for intellectual integrity and spiritual discernment had earned him respect throughout the church hierarchy, found himself leading an investigation that would require him to navigate between the conflicting demands of political expediency and ecclesiastical truth. His commission included some of the most learned theologians and canon lawyers in Europe, men whose expertise in matters of doctrine and legal procedure provided hope that the Templar investigation might yet be conducted according to standards that would satisfy both justice and faith. The cardinals examining evidence that had been gathered through procedures that violated every principle of fair inquiry discovered immediately that the case against the Templars rested upon foundations far less solid than Philip's confident assertions had suggested. The confessions that had seemed so damning when announced in French town squares appeared far more questionable when subjected to careful scrutiny by men trained in the complexities of theological and legal analysis. The consistency that had initially impressed observers revealed itself to be the result of coordinated preparation rather than independent testimony. The testimony from across Europe that began reaching the Papal Commission during the autumn of 1308 painted a picture that contradicted almost every element of the French accusations. From England came reports of Templars who had lived exemplary religious lives, whose devotion to orthodox Christian practice had been witnessed by countless clergy and lay people over decades of service. From Germany arrived testimonies about Templar charitable works that had supported thousands of pilgrims, maintained hospitals for the sick, and provided assistance to the poor on a scale that rivaled the efforts of any religious organization in Christendom. The search for concrete proof of the allegations that had justified the destruction of the order revealed the fundamental weakness of Philip's case. Despite months of investigation, torture, and interrogation, no physical evidence had been discovered to support the most serious charges. No idols resembling the described Baphomet had been found in Templar establishments. No documents outlining heretical practices had been discovered in their extensive archives. No witnesses independent of the French investigation had come forward to corroborate the accusations that had been proclaimed with such certainty. Political pressure from Philip IV intensified as the papal investigation began to cast doubt upon the reliability of evidence that had been obtained through methods that the Church traditionally regarded as inherently suspect. The French king, who had staked his reputation and his kingdom's financial stability upon the success of his action against the Templars, could not afford to have papal authorities conclude that his charges were unfounded. Royal agents worked tirelessly to influence the Commission's proceedings, offering incentives to potential witnesses while applying pressure to church officials, whose cooperation was essential for maintaining the appearance of ecclesiastical approval for what had been fundamentally a secular political action. The defenders of the order who emerged during the papal investigation represented a coalition of voices that challenged every aspect of the case against the Templars. These included not only members of the order itself, many of whom had been imprisoned and tortured but remained willing to speak in defense of their former brothers, but also secular clergy, lay witnesses, and even some political figures who recognized that the destruction of the Templars based upon fabricated evidence could establish precedents that would threaten the security of every religious institution in Europe. Templars who spoke in defense despite facing continued imprisonment, and the possibility of execution demonstrated a level of institutional loyalty that was difficult to reconcile with accusations of an organization that had supposedly abandoned Christian principles in favor of heretical practices. These men, many of whom bore the physical marks of torture inflicted during their interrogations, maintained their testimony about Templar orthodoxy even when they understood that their continued resistance might result in their deaths. The lack of credible evidence became increasingly apparent as the investigation expanded beyond the confines of France to encompass territories where royal pressure was less intense and where investigators could examine Templar practices without the constraints that had characterized the French proceedings. In these locations, the testimony consistently supported Templar claims of orthodox Christian practice, charitable service, and military dedication to the defense of Christian territories and pilgrims. Testimony supporting Templar orthodoxy accumulated from sources that had no apparent motive for defending an organization that had already been condemned by powerful political authorities. Parish priests testified about Templar participation in normal Christian worship. Merchants spoke of business dealings that had been conducted with scrupulous honesty over periods of decades. Pilgrims described protection and assistance they had received from Templars whose behavior had been consistently Christian in both letter and spirit. The defense of their charitable works provided perhaps the most compelling evidence for Templar innocence, as the extensive records of their hospitals, schools, and assistance programs created a documentary trail that was impossible to fabricate or misinterpret. The Order's systematic support for pilgrimage, their maintenance of medical facilities throughout Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, and their consistent provision of assistance to travellers and the poor had been witnessed by too many independent observers to be dismissed as mere pretense covering heretical activities. International scepticism about French claims grew as other European kingdoms conducted their own investigations and discovered that the evidence supporting Philip's accusations was far less substantial than had initially appeared. English investigators, operating under royal authorities who had their own political reasons for maintaining independence from French influence, found little to support the charges that had been proclaimed with such certainty. German princes, many of whom had welcomed Templar refugees fleeing from French persecution, reported that their investigations had revealed no evidence of heretical practices among the knights who had sought sanctuary in their territories. The most significant revelation to emerge from the papal investigation was the discovery of a document that would remain hidden from public knowledge for 7 centuries, but which completely transformed the Pope's understanding of Templar guilt or innocence. The Chinon parchment, a secret record of private conversations between Pope Clement V and the imprisoned Templar leaders, revealed that the Pope himself had conducted a clandestine investigation that led him to grant absolution to Jacques de Molay and the other senior members of the order based upon his personal conviction of their innocence. The secret papal absolution of Templar leaders, conducted away from the political pressures and public scrutiny that characterized the official proceedings, represented Clement's private acknowledgement that the charges against the order were unfounded. In this confidential setting, where political considerations could be temporarily set aside in favour of spiritual responsibilities, the Pope had heard testimony and examined evidence that convinced him that the Templars were guilty of no crimes beyond the minor irregularities that could be found in any large organisation operating across diverse cultural and political environments. Pope Clement's private investigation, conducted with the thoroughness and discretion that his public position made necessary, had revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Templar affair. An organisation accused of abandoning Christian principles had consistently demonstrated greater devotion to those principles than many of the secular rulers who were demanding their destruction. The Pope's decision to grant secret absolution reflected his recognition that justice demanded acknowledgement of Templar innocence, even if political necessity required public actions that contradicted that acknowledgement. The hidden document's implications extended far beyond the immediate question of Templar guilt or innocence to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between spiritual truth and political expediency in the governance of medieval Christendom. If the Pope himself believed the Templars to be innocent, yet felt compelled by political pressures to participate in their destruction, what did this reveal about the capacity of church authority to protect justice when it conflicted with the interests of powerful secular rulers? The Pope's impossible position became increasingly apparent as the investigation proceeded, and evidence of Templar innocence accumulated while political pressure for their condemnation intensified. Clement found himself caught between his spiritual obligations as the leader of universal Christendom and his political dependence upon French support for his papacy. To vindicate the Templars completely would mean openly challenging Philip IV and risking the destruction of the French alliance that kept him in power. Yet to condemn them completely would mean participating in what he privately believed to be a gross miscarriage of justice. The political reality versus spiritual truth dilemma that tormented Pope Clement represented a fundamental crisis in medieval church-state relations that would have consequences extending far beyond the fate of the Knights Templar. The precedent of secular rulers successfully pressuring ecclesiastical authorities to condemn religious organizations based upon politically motivated accusations would reshape the balance of power between temporal and spiritual authorities throughout Europe. The responses of other European kingdoms to papal pressure for universal action against the Templars reveal the complex interplay of political interests, religious convictions, and practical considerations that shaped international reactions to the French initiative. These varied responses demonstrated that Philip's success in France was by no means inevitable, and that alternative approaches to the Templar question were both possible and, in some cases, more consistent with the available evidence. England's initial refusal to persecute Templars within English territories reflected both King Edward II's political independence from French influence and his administrators' careful evaluation of the evidence supporting the charges against the order. English investigations, conducted with the same thoroughness that characterized the best medieval legal proceedings, found little credible support for the accusations that had been proclaimed with such certainty in France. English Templars, when questioned under procedures that did not rely upon torture, consistently maintained their innocence and provided testimony that supported rather than contradicted claims of Orthodox Christian practice. Germany's protection of Templars fleeing French persecution represented an even more direct challenge to Philip's efforts to secure universal condemnation of the order. German princes, operating within the complex political structure of the Holy Roman Empire, possessed both the legal authority and the military capability necessary to provide sanctuary for refugees whose guilt had not been established through procedures that met German standards of legal evidence. The contrast between German protection and French persecution provided a vivid demonstration of how different political systems produced different approaches to the same accusations. Portugal's transformation of fleeing Templars into the Order of Christ represented perhaps the most creative solution to the political and religious challenges created by the Templar crisis. Portuguese authorities, recognizing both the value of Templar military expertise and the questionable nature of the charges against them, simply renamed the organization while maintaining its essential functions and personnel. This approach satisfied papal requirements for official dissolution of the Templar order, while preserving the practical benefits that Templar presence provided for Portuguese military and commercial interests. Scotland's sanctuary for fleeing knights created a situation where former Templars could continue their religious and military vocations under different organizational structures that provided protection from the political pressures that had destroyed their original order. Scottish independence from both French political influence and papal temporal authority enabled policies that prioritized practical considerations over the political necessities that constrained other European rulers. The varying European reactions to papal pressure demonstrated that the Templar destruction was neither inevitable nor universally accepted as justified by the available evidence. Alternative responses were possible, and in several cases proved more successful in serving both religious and secular interests than the approach that had been adopted in France. The Council of Vienne, convened in 1311 to determine the final disposition of the Templar question, represented Pope Clement's last opportunity to balance the competing demands of spiritual justice and political necessity. The council brought together the highest authorities of the Church to consider evidence that had been gathered through years of investigation and to reach conclusions that would determine not only the fate of the remaining Templars, but the precedents that would govern future church-state relations throughout Christendom. The final papal decision to suppress the order rather than condemn it represented a carefully crafted compromise that acknowledged the political realities constraining papal authority, while avoiding explicit endorsement of charges that the Pope privately believed to be unfounded. By suppressing rather than condemning the Templars, Clement avoided formal declaration that they were guilty of the crimes alleged against them, while satisfying Philip III's fundamental requirement that the order cease to exist as an independent organization. Political pressure and church politics that shaped the council's proceedings revealed the extent to which secular influences had penetrated ecclesiastical decision-making processes, the presence of French representatives, the pressure applied through various diplomatic channels, and the implicit threats to papal authority that accompanied demands for Templar condemnation demonstrated that the Church's capacity for independent judgment had been severely compromised by political considerations. The suppression of the order, announced through papal bull rather than conciliar decision to avoid the appearance of ecclesiastical approval for charges that many council members privately questioned, marked the official end of an organisation that had shaped European development for 2 centuries. Yet the manner of this suppression, accomplished through administrative decree rather than judicial condemnation, preserved the possibility that future authorities might reach different conclusions about Templar guilt or innocence. The distribution of Templar assets, which had been the practical goal underlying much of the political manoeuvring that had characterized the entire affair, provided the final demonstration of the extent to which secular interests had triumphed over spiritual justice. The wealth that the Templars had accumulated through centuries of service to Christendom was distributed according to political considerations rather than any principle of justice or religious appropriateness. The official end of the Knights Templar on March 22, 1312, marked the conclusion of one of the most successful political manipulations in medieval history, yet also established precedents for the destruction of religious institutions that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate benefits that Philip IV had achieved. The warrior monks who had once seemed as permanent as the stones of Jerusalem itself had been destroyed not by Muslim armies or Christian enemies, but by the greed and political ambition of a ruler who had discovered that even the most powerful religious organizations were vulnerable to sufficiently ruthless and systematic attack. The trials had ended, the evidence had been weighed, and truth had been subordinated to political necessity in a manner that would reshape the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority throughout the medieval world. Justice had been sacrificed upon the altar of royal expediency, yet the questions raised by the Templar destruction would continue to challenge the consciences of future generations, seeking to understand the proper relationship between power and truth in Christian society. In the deepest dungeons of the Château de Chinon, where stone walls wept with centuries of accumulated moisture, and the only light came from torches that cast dancing shadows like souls in torment, Jacques de Molay spent his final years in a solitude that would have broken lesser men. The last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, once the commander of armies and counsellor to kings, now occupied a cell barely large enough for a man to lie prostrate, his world reduced to the rhythms of prayer that had sustained him through 7 decades of life and 7 years of imprisonment. The transformation of the man during these final years was witnessed by the few who were permitted to see him: papal legates, royal officials, and the occasional confessor whose discretion could be trusted. They found not the broken figure that prolonged imprisonment and repeated torture might have been expected to produce, but a man whose spirit had been refined by suffering until it burned with the pure flame of absolute conviction. The Jacques de Molay, who had once sought compromise and accommodation with secular authorities, had been replaced by a figure whose moral clarity cut through the political complexities of his situation like a sword through silk. His preparation for death became a matter of systematic spiritual discipline that would have impressed the most rigorous monastic reformers. Each day began before dawn with prayers that continued through the canonical hours, his voice echoing in the stone chamber as he recited the same psalms that had comforted generations of Templars facing death in distant battles. He maintained the physical disciplines of his order despite his confinement, exercising within the narrow confines of his cell with the methodical persistence that had once made Templar training legendary throughout Christendom. More significantly, he used his imprisonment to prepare a final testimony that would challenge the foundations of the case that had been constructed against his order. Through careful conversations with the few visitors he was allowed, through messages passed along networks that even royal security could not completely eliminate, and through the sheer force of his moral authority, de Molay began to construct a defence of Templar innocence that would outlive both his own death and the political convenience that had condemned his brothers. The decision to proceed with his execution represented Philip IV's recognition that keeping the former Grand Master alive indefinitely posed greater risks than the dramatic gesture of his public death. De Molay's continued existence, even in prison, provided a focal point for those who questioned the justice of the Templar destruction. His persistent claims of innocence, maintained despite years of imprisonment, and the inducements that had been offered for his cooperation, created credibility problems that undermined the official narrative of Templar guilt. The public execution, scheduled for March 18, 1314, on the Île aux Juifs in the Seine, was designed to provide the symbolic closure that Philip believed necessary to end the Templar controversy permanently. The location, a small island that could be surrounded by royal guards while providing clear sight lines for the crowds that would gather on both banks of the river, offered maximum visibility for what was intended to be the final demonstration of royal triumph over religious resistance. The morning dawned grey and cold, with a kind of March weather that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of a population that had grown weary of the spectacles of persecution that had characterized Philip's reign. As Jacques de Molay was led from his prison cell for the final time, those who witnessed his appearance noted that 7 years of confinement had left their mark on his physical frame. His hair had turned white, his face bore the lines of suffering, his body showed the effects of inadequate nutrition and lack of sunlight. Yet his bearing retained the dignity that had made him a natural leader of men. The procession through the streets of Paris attracted crowds whose reactions revealed the complex feelings that the Templar affair had generated among the common people. Some shouted accusations and curses, convinced by years of royal propaganda that they were witnessing the just execution of a heretic and traitor. Others maintained respectful silence, uncertain about the truth of the charges but troubled by the systematic destruction of an organization that had served Christendom for 2 centuries. Still others, particularly among the pilgrims and merchants who had benefited from Templar services, openly wept at the sight of the aged knight being led to his death. The pyre that awaited him on the island had been constructed with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all of Philip's public spectacles. The wood had been arranged to ensure a slow burn that would maximize both the suffering of the condemned man and the visibility of his death to the watching crowds. Royal officials, church representatives, and curious nobility had been positioned to provide official witness to what was intended to be the final scene in the drama that had begun 7 years earlier with the dawn raids across France. Yet as Jacques de Molay was bound to the stake and the flames began to lick at the wood beneath his feet, he found his voice one final time to deliver words that would echo through history with far greater impact than Philip III could have imagined. In a voice that carried clearly across the water to the crowds gathered on both banks of the Seine, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar pronounced a curse that would transform his execution from a demonstration of royal power into a prophecy of divine justice. His final words, preserved in chronicles that recorded them with the precision reserved for statements that contemporary observers recognized as historically significant, called upon God to judge between the Templars and their persecutors, to vindicate the innocent and punish the guilty according to divine rather than human justice. More specifically, he summoned both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to appear before God's tribunal within the year, there to answer for their destruction of an order that had served the Church faithfully for 2 centuries. The curse that he pronounced with his dying breath was not the desperate malediction of a broken man seeking revenge, but the solemn invocation of divine justice by one who had maintained his innocence through years of suffering and now committed his cause to a higher court than any earthly tribunal could provide. As the flames consumed his aged body, Jacques de Molay died not as a condemned heretic, but as a martyr whose final testimony would outlive the political calculations that had condemned him. The symbolic end of the Templars that his death represented was immediately recognized by contemporary observers as marking a fundamental transformation in the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in medieval Europe. The organization that had once seemed as permanent as the Church itself had been destroyed not by external enemies, but by the political ambitions of rulers who had discovered that even the most privileged religious institutions were vulnerable to systematic attack by sufficiently determined secular authorities. Yet even as the flames on the Îlot Juif announced the official end of the Knights Templar, the curse that Jacques de Molay had pronounced began to manifest itself with a rapidity that seemed to confirm divine intervention in human affairs. The medieval understanding of justice, which assumed that God would ultimately vindicate the innocent and punish the guilty regardless of earthly verdicts, found dramatic confirmation in the series of deaths that followed the Grand Master's execution. Pope Clement V's death, occurring barely a month after de Molay's execution, was interpreted by contemporary observers as the first fulfillment of the Templar curse. The Pope, whose health had been declining for years, succumbed to what appeared to be a sudden illness that struck him down just as spring was beginning to bring new life to the countryside around Avignon. His death on April 20th, 1314, was seen by many as divine judgment upon a pontiff who had allowed political considerations to override spiritual justice in his treatment of the Templars. Philip IV's death in November 1314, following a hunting accident that left him fatally injured, provided even more dramatic confirmation of the curse's power. The king, who had seemed to triumph completely over his enemies, found himself facing his own mortality within the year that Jacques de Molay had specified. His death, while engaged in the aristocratic pastime that symbolized royal leisure and power, carried symbolic weight that was not lost on contemporary observers seeking to understand the relationship between earthly authority and divine justice. The end of the Capetian line that had ruled France for over 3 centuries, achieved through a series of deaths and succession crises that began immediately after Philip's demise, provided the final element in what medieval observers regarded as unmistakable evidence of divine intervention in human affairs. The royal dynasty that had seemed so secure in its power that it could challenge even the Church with impunity found itself extinguished within a generation of the Templar destruction. Medieval beliefs about divine justice, which assumed that God's judgment would ultimately prevail over human injustice regardless of the immediate apparent success of wrongdoers, found powerful confirmation in the rapid sequence of deaths that followed Jacques de Molay's execution. The temporal authorities, who had seemed to triumph completely over spiritual opposition, discovered that their apparent victory contained the seeds of their own destruction. The legend of the Templar curse that emerged from these events would persist for centuries, providing future generations with a powerful example of how divine justice could manifest itself in human history. The story of Jacques de Molay's final words and their dramatic fulfillment became part of European folklore, inspiring those who sought to resist unjust authority, while warning those who might be tempted to abuse their power that earthly success could not protect them from ultimate accountability. Yet the most significant legacy of the Templar destruction was not the dramatic deaths of their persecutors, but the scattered remnants of the order that survived to carry forward the ideals that political persecution could not eliminate. The knights who escaped the initial arrests, those who found sanctuary in kingdoms that refused to participate in Philip's persecution, and those who simply disappeared into the broader population of medieval Europe, preserved elements of Templar tradition that would influence European development for centuries to come. Those who escaped the persecution included both knights who fled to distant territories where royal authority could not reach them, and others who assumed new identities that allowed them to remain within European society while avoiding continued persecution. Some found their way to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce's conflict with papal authority created opportunities for former Templars to serve new masters without betraying their fundamental loyalties. Others travelled to Portugal, where they were officially absorbed into the newly created Order of Christ, while maintaining many of their traditional practices and beliefs. Integration into other military orders provided another avenue for the continuation of Templar traditions and expertise. The Knights Hospitaller, despite their historical rivalry with the Templars, absorbed significant numbers of former Templars whose military and administrative skills were too valuable to waste. The Teutonic Knights, operating in the Baltic regions where papal authority was less concentrated on the Templar question, similarly incorporated former Templars who could contribute to their ongoing military campaigns against pagan enemies. The hidden survival networks that enabled former Templars to maintain contact with each other, while avoiding detection by authorities that continued to seek them, represented one of the most sophisticated clandestine organizations of the medieval period. These networks, built upon the commercial and communication systems that the Templars had developed during their centuries of operation, enabled the preservation and transmission of organizational knowledge, ritual practices, and ideological commitments that official persecution had been designed to eliminate entirely. Knights who disappeared into history, their ultimate fates unknown to contemporary authorities and lost to later historians, represented perhaps the most significant element in the Templar legacy. These men, trained in the military and administrative skills that had made their order legendary, carried their expertise into new contexts, where it could influence European development in ways that were invisible to those who believed they had successfully eliminated Templar influence from medieval society. The continuation of Templar ideals, preserved and transmitted through channels that political persecution could not identify or eliminate, would prove more significant for European history than the immediate political success that Philip V had achieved through his destruction of the order. The principles of military professionalism, financial innovation, and institutional independence that had characterized the Templars at their peak continued to influence European development through the men who had learned these principles during their service with the order and who applied them in new contexts throughout the later medieval and early modern periods. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay on that cold March morning in 1314 marked the end of the Knights Templar as an institutional reality, yet they also marked the beginning of the Templars as a legendary inspiration for those who sought to resist injustice, preserve ancient wisdom, and maintain hope that truth would ultimately triumph over the political calculations that seemed to dominate human affairs. In his defiant death, the last Grand Master had achieved a more lasting victory than any his order had won during 2 centuries of military campaigns. 7 centuries have passed since Jacques de Molay's final word echoed across the Seine, yet the questions raised by his martyrdom continue to challenge our understanding of power, justice, and the complex relationship between political necessity and historical truth. Modern scholarship, armed with documentary evidence unavailable to medieval chroniclers, and freed from the political pressures that shaped contemporary accounts, has reached a consensus that would have vindicated the last Grand Master's dying proclamation of innocence while confirming his assessment of his persecutors' motives. The historical assessment that has emerged from decades of careful research by scholars working in archives across Europe paints a picture that differs dramatically from the official narrative that justified the Templars' destruction. Contemporary historians, examining the evidence with the methodical precision that the order itself would have appreciated, have found no credible support for the charges of heresy, blasphemy, or systematic corruption that provided the legal foundation for Philip Thor's unprecedented assault on ecclesiastical authority. The modern scholarly consensus on the trials represents one of the most complete reversals in historical interpretation that academic research has ever achieved, where medieval chroniclers, writing under the influence of royal propaganda and papal political considerations, often accepted the official charges at face value. Modern historians have systematically dismantled every element of the case against the Templars. The confessions that once seemed so damning have been revealed as the products of torture and coercion. The witnesses whose testimony supported the accusations have been identified as paid informants or coerced prisoners whose credibility was compromised by their dependence upon royal favour. The political motivations behind the persecution have been laid bare through careful analysis of Philip Thor's financial records, diplomatic correspondence, and the broader context of his conflicts with ecclesiastical authority. The French king's desperate need for funds to finance his military campaigns and maintain his court's extravagant lifestyle created pressures that made the Templars' vast wealth an irresistible target. His previous success in challenging papal authority through the humiliation of Pope Boniface thus demonstrated that even the most sacred institutions were vulnerable to sufficiently ruthless political attack, The lack of credible evidence for heresy becomes more apparent with each new examination of the documentary record. Despite years of investigation by authorities who had every incentive to discover proof of the allegations they had made, no physical evidence was ever found to support the most serious charges. No idols resembling the mysterious Baphomet were discovered in Templar establishments. No documents outlining heretical practices were found in their extensive archives. No independent witnesses came forward to corroborate the accusations that had been proclaimed with such certainty. The Templars as victims of royal greed represents the interpretation that best explains both the timing and the methods of their destruction. Philip's systematic approach to seizing Templar assets, his coordination with ecclesiastical authorities who could provide legal justification for his actions, and his success in preventing effective resistance through simultaneous arrests across French territories all point to a carefully planned operation designed to transfer wealth rather than eliminate heresy. Their true historical significance extends far beyond their role as victims of medieval political manipulation to encompass their genuine contributions to European development during the 2 centuries of their existence. The Templars pioneered military innovations that influenced warfare for generations, created financial systems that laid the foundation for modern international banking, and demonstrated organizational capabilities that would not be matched until the emergence of modern corporate structures. Their integration of military, religious, and commercial functions created a template for institutional development that influenced everything from later military orders to modern multinational organizations. Yet even as modern scholarship has vindicated the Templars' historical reputation, their destruction has generated a mythic legacy that often overshadows their actual achievements. The gap between historical fact and popular imagination has created a parallel narrative that transforms the warrior monks from skilled administrators and professional soldiers into guardians of ancient secrets and keepers of mystical knowledge that could reshape human understanding of spiritual reality. Freemasonry's claimed connections to the Knights Templar represent one of the most persistent elements in this mythic legacy, despite historical evidence that clearly demonstrates the lack of any direct organizational continuity between the medieval military order and the modern fraternal society. Masonic traditions that incorporate Templar symbolism and ritual elements reflect the powerful appeal of the Templar legend rather than any genuine historical connection between the 2 organizations. The appropriation of Templar imagery by Freemasonry speaks to the enduring power of the warrior monk ideal, while creating confusion about the actual historical relationship between medieval and modern institutions. Holy Grail legends and Templar mysteries have similarly transformed the order from a historical organization whose activities can be documented through surviving records into a repository for humanity's deepest spiritual longings and most persistent questions about the nature of divine truth. The association of the Templars with the Grail legend, while lacking any medieval foundation, reflects the powerful appeal of organizations that seem to bridge the gap between earthly power and spiritual authority. These legends satisfy psychological needs that purely historical accounts cannot address, providing meaning and mystery in contexts where documentation reveals only the mundane realities of medieval institutional life. Oak Island treasure hunting and similar pursuits represent the transformation of Templar wealth from a historical reality that can be traced through surviving financial records into a mythical treasure that continues to inspire modern adventurers seeking tangible connections to medieval romance. The idea that vast Templar hoards remain hidden somewhere in the modern world appeals to imaginations that find contemporary treasure hunts more exciting than the documented reality of how Templar assets were actually distributed following the Order's suppression. Dan Brown and popular culture have further amplified these mythic elements, creating fictional narratives that often become more influential in shaping popular understanding than scholarly historical research. The commercial success of stories that transform the Templars into guardians of world-shaking secrets demonstrates the continued appeal of their legend, while creating challenges for historians seeking to communicate the equally fascinating but more complex reality of their actual historical role. The separation of myth from history remains an ongoing challenge for anyone seeking to understand the Knights Templar's genuine significance. The mythic elements, while historically unfounded, serve important psychological and cultural functions that explain their persistence despite contradictory evidence. The historical elements, while less dramatic than their fictional counterparts, reveal patterns of institutional development, political manipulation, and human behavior that provide genuine insights into the forces that have shaped European civilization. The lessons for today that emerge from careful study of the Templars' rise and fall remain as relevant in the modern world as they were in medieval Europe. The danger of unchecked power, demonstrated so clearly in Philip IV's successful destruction of an organization that had seemed immune to secular interference, continues to threaten institutions and individuals who accumulate wealth and influence without maintaining the political relationships necessary to protect their achievements. The intersection of money and politics that characterized the Templar affair provides timeless insights into how financial considerations can override moral and legal principles when powerful individuals find themselves facing fiscal pressures that conventional solutions cannot address. The transformation of the Templars from valued allies into convenient victims demonstrates how quickly institutional relationships can change when economic necessities create opportunities for those willing to abandon previous commitments. Religious persecution and state authority intersect in the Templar case in ways that illuminate ongoing tensions between spiritual and temporal power in societies where both religious and secular institutions claim ultimate authority over human behavior. The success of Philip's manipulation of ecclesiastical procedures to legitimize what was essentially secular robbery provides object lessons about the vulnerability of religious institutions to political pressure when they become dependent upon secular support for their continued existence. The price of success in medieval society, as demonstrated by the Templars' fate, included the accumulation of enemies who would eventually find ways to turn institutional achievements into vulnerabilities that could be exploited for personal or political gain. The very wealth and power that made the Templars indispensable to European development also made them irresistible targets for rulers who recognized that destroying the order could solve their financial problems while eliminating potential challenges to their authority. How legends are born from tragedy finds perfect illustration in the transformation of the Templars from historical victims of political persecution into mythical guardians of ancient wisdom. The gap between their actual fate and their legendary status demonstrates how human imagination can transform even the most thoroughly documented historical events into narratives that serve contemporary psychological needs rather than historical accuracy. The eternal knights that the Templars have become in Western imagination transcend their historical limitations to embody ideals that continue to inspire modern institutions and individuals. Their influence on military orders, both medieval and modern, can be traced through organizational structures, training methods, and institutional cultures that preserve elements of Templar innovation while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. Banking innovations that shaped modern finance include fundamental concepts that the Templars pioneered during their evolution from military order to international financial institution. Letters of credit, international currency exchange, and sophisticated accounting procedures that they developed to support their military and commercial operations provided foundations upon which later financial innovations were built. Modern international banking systems still employ principles that were first systematically implemented by medieval warrior monks, seeking practical solutions to the challenges of operating across multiple political and economic systems. Architectural achievements that endure include not only the physical structures that the Templars constructed throughout Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, but also the engineering principles and construction techniques that influenced subsequent military and civilian architecture. Their innovations in castle design, siege warfare technology, and urban planning contributed to developments that shaped European cities and defensive systems for centuries after their suppression. The ideal of warrior monks in Western culture continues to resonate in contexts far removed from medieval military orders, providing a template for individuals and organizations that seek to combine practical effectiveness with principled service to transcendent values. The Templar model of dedicated professionals who subordinate personal interest to institutional mission remains influential in military, religious, and secular contexts, where effectiveness requires both technical competence and ethical commitment. Their place in the medieval imagination has been preserved and transmitted through literary, artistic, and cultural channels that ensure their continued relevance to successive generations seeking to understand the relationship between power and principle in human affairs. The Knights Templar have achieved the immortality that their historical achievements alone might not have secured, living on in human memory as symbols of both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in institutions that attempt to serve both God and mammon in a world where political realities often override moral considerations. And so ends the tale of the Knights Templar warrior monks who rose from humble beginnings to reshape medieval Europe, only to fall victim to the very wealth and power they accumulated in service of God. Their white mantles are dust, their red crosses faded, but their story endures, a reminder that even the mightiest orders are mortal while legends live forever.